We cannot stand by while our freedoms are stripped away. Tonight, we make our stand.
Imagine that you in Virginia in the summer of 1676. Picture yourself walking through miles and miles of tobacco fields, really the most valuable commodity in the colony. The air is thick and humid. Around you, the tall plants sway gently in the breeze. In the distance, you hear the steady drone of cicadas. And if you look toward the west, you might catch a glimpse of fires flickering on the horizon. Fires lit by the very people who are cultivating this precious tobacco. This image is one of wealth, prosperity, and growth. It is also an image of simmering discontent. Welcome to the first chapter of our course. I'm your instructor, and in this series, we go in to explore the fascinating and complicated history of colonial America from 1607 to 1763. So, sit back, grab whatever beverage you desire, and let's get started. Alright, before we dive into the heart of this episode, let us start with a quick overview of what you can expect as we move through this course together. Over the next several lessons, we're going to consider all aspects of life in British North America. We will study how people made money, the kinds of work they did, how they got along with each other and with the native peoples who lived on this land. We will also examine the ways in which these colonies grew and changed over time, and we'll consider the kinds of challenges they faced as well. By the end of this course, you should have a pretty good sense of how the colonial period laid the foundation for the American Revolution and for the kind of nation that would eventually emerge after the war. So now let's return to the fires burning on the western horizon. As we saw in the last section, the year is 1676 and the location is Virginia. But to understand what's going on here, we need to rewind the clock a bit. The story of colonial America is long and complicated, but luckily for us, we don't have to go back very far to see the origins of this particular moment. In 1607, England established the first of many colonies along the Atlantic coast of North America. As the Virginia Company, a group of investors who were known as a joint stock company, set about establishing a settlement in the New World. Their goal was to make money. They hoped that their colony would produce valuable goods that could then be sold in markets back in England. But it was not easy. The first decade or so was marked by great hardship. The settlers suffered through what is sometimes known as the starving time, when food was so scarce that some resorted to cannibalism. They struggled to establish a stable food supply and protect themselves from attacks by the indigenous peoples of the region. Still, over time, the colony did begin to grow, and by the 1660s, the Virginia colony was one of the most successful of the fledgling English efforts. The growth of the colony can be attributed to many factors, including the introduction of a labor system known as indentured servitude. Under this arrangement, an increasing number of Europeans came to the colony, not as independent settlers, but as laborers bound to a master for a set period of years. In exchange for their service, they would receive room and board, and at the end of their term, they would gain their freedom and often a small amount of land. Other colonists built fortunes by cultivating lucrative cash crops like tobacco, which had been introduced to the colony a few decades earlier by an explorer named John Rolfe. Rolfe's introduction of tobacco proved to be an incredible boon to the colony, because as it turned out, the soils of Virginia were exceptionally suited to growing the plant, and thus began a boom in tobacco cultivation. And as we mentioned earlier, the result was miles and miles of swaying tobacco plants under a humid sky. Now, tobacco was a highly profitable crop, especially for those who owned large tracts of land. For them, the financial rewards of cultivating tobacco were immense. But the flip side of this was that, to make a profit, a planter needed a lot of land. In fact, the vast majority of the wealthiest men in the colony were men who owned large plantations worked by hundreds of African slaves. You see, while indentured servitude did bring a lot of people to the colony, it was not the only source of labor. From the beginning, European countries had claimed the right to use enslaved Africans in the Americas, and England was no exception. As a result, many Africans were brought to the western shores of the Atlantic and sold into a life of forced labor, and as tobacco cultivation expanded, the demand for labor on the plantations increased. Now, despite the profitability of tobacco, owning a plantation and cultivating the crop was expensive. There were many expenses associated with preparing the land, purchasing seeds and tools, hiring workers and feeding them, and the list goes on. Still, For many Englishmen, the potential rewards of owning a plantation were worth the cost, and so the colony became increasingly dominated by men who pursued this form of wealth. But not everyone shared in the prosperity. While the planters were becoming quite rich, a significant number of people in the colony did not own much land at all. These folks were usually poorer men who carved out small homesteads on the edge of the wilderness. And these people, known as frontier settlers, felt increasingly threatened by the planters. Not only did the planters take up more and more of the available land, but in the eyes of the frontier settlers, they were also a political threat. You see, as the colony grew, the distance between the settlers and the English government grew as well. At the beginning of the colony, the distance was fairly small. But as the colony expanded westward, it became harder and harder for the governor, who was appointed by the English king, to maintain order out on the frontier. And so the frontier settlers were increasingly on their own to defend themselves against attacks by native peoples. What's more, the frontier settlers were frustrated by the taxes imposed on them by the English government. And again, since the governor was so far away, they had no real recourse to appeal his decisions. Then there were the native peoples themselves. As we've seen, the English had claimed all of this land by right of discovery, and yet the English colonies existed in a state of constant negotiation with numerous tribes, the powerful chiefdoms of the Great Plains. The 5 nations of the Iroquois Confederacy and the mighty empire of the Cherokee were just a few of the groups who lived in this region, and while relations between the colonists and the natives were often cordial, there were frequent disputes over land, resources, and power. So by the mid-1670s, the colony of Virginia was a place on edge. Wealthy planters cultivated valuable tobacco crops on large plantations worked by hundreds of African slaves. Manuel. Poor frontier settlers carved out homesteads on the edge of the wilderness and felt increasingly threatened by the growing power of the planters and the difficulty of defending themselves against attacks by Native Americans. And finally, there were the native peoples themselves, powerful and numerous, living a way of life that had existed for centuries before the arrival of the English. And in this volatile environment, something happened that would change the colony forever. We'll pick up the story here in the next chapter, and to understand what happens next, we need to pause and think about the events leading up to Bacon's Rebellion. The story of Bacon's Rebellion has all the makings of a classic riot. Poor frontier settlers band together and attack the property of the wealthy planters. But while it is true that the rebellion involved violence and upheaval, it was also something more. In many ways, Bacon's Rebellion was an early call for representation, a demand that the government better represent the interests of the people. And that is a theme that will echo throughout the colonial period and culminate in the American Revolution. So stay tuned for that. And until next time, thanks for watching. The year is 1676 and you're watching this channel. Bacon's Rebellion is about to kick off in the Virginia colony. But before we get into the action, we need to set the stage. So let's go back to Chapter 2, Seeds of Discontent, Virginia before the storm. Virginia in the 1670s was an interesting place. It was growing quickly, but its economy was tanking. More people were coming to the colony than leaving it, and that led to some serious problems. Let's start with the population. In 1624, the Virginia Company had reported a population of just 1,200. In 1678, that number had grown to over 14,000. The largest group after the original colonists were servants, who would work for a set period of years and then be freed. Between 1636 and 1678, nearly 10,000 indentured servants arrived in Virginia, but the boom years were from 1650 to 1660, when 4 out of every 5 new arrival was an indentured servant. That was due to laws passed by the English Parliament which mandated that all children born in the colonies to parents under indenture were themselves bound to servitude until they turned 21. This meant that while many servants came willingly, there was also a large contingent of people who had no say in the matter at all. These growing pains caused by the influx of new people led to other issues, like the fallen price for tobacco. We'll talk more about the economics of tobacco later. But suffice it to say here that because there was so much demand for land to grow tobacco, and because of how much labor it took to run a tobacco plantation, this led to some massive disparities in wealth across the colony. Land ownership was becoming increasingly difficult for all but the most wealthy. As far as land grants went, the king owned all of it. and he granted parcels to those whom he deemed worthy. For most people, getting enough land to build a decent life on was going to be an impossibility. By the middle of the century, the cost of land was forcing smaller farmers near the coast to move farther west. There was plenty of room in the unsettled areas of the colony, or so they thought. While the western part of Virginia was indeed unsettled, it was hardly empty. It was home to several thousand members of the Monahawk, the Iroquois, the Shawnee, and the Cherokee nations. These tribes had lived in what the English called the New World for thousands of years. They had complex governments, cultures, and histories long before the first Europeans settled in North America. But those are stories for another time. For now, we'll stick to the story of Virginia. The further west settlers pushed, the more tension grew between them and the indigenous peoples who already lived there. Many of the settlers who moved west were poor, or at least not wealthy enough to afford land. When they found themselves living alongside these established tribes, they often found work as hunters or day laborers. However, the peace was often broken by skirmishes along the frontier. In 1673, a young man named Nathaniel Bacon Jr. witnessed one such skirmish firsthand. He was working on a farm near the falls of the Ohio River, when a group of horsemen attacked his neighbors, killing them and stealing their goods. Bacon and his associates pursued the attackers and killed one of them, taking his head as proof of their deed. At the time, this sort of violence wasn't considered unusual. In fact, the governor at the time said it was just retribution for earlier attacks by the tribesmen. But this incident would come to define Bacon's early career. Now let's meet the leader of the colony, Governor Sir William Berkeley. He'd been appointed by King Charles II and sworn to uphold the peace between the settlers and the tribes. Berkeley was rich, well-educated, and cultured. He'd been a member of Parliament and represented England's upper class. After serving in Virginia, he expected to return to England a wealthy man. He bought a huge estate and laid plans for his retirement. In his mind, this colony could not succeed if it descended into chaos. As more and more settlers poured into Virginia, the pressure to expand westward increased. Berkeley knew that if he didn't keep the peace with the tribes, the entire colony would be thrown into disorder. His solution was a series of treaties that kept the tribes from selling land directly to settlers. Instead, Berkeley planned to buy the land from the tribes and then resell it to settlers, keeping the profits for himself and ensuring a peaceful border. But as the years went on, the treaties became more and more unpopular. Small farmers complained that they'd been promised land in the West and the governor was keeping them from it. Others argued that the prices Berkeley was paying for the lands were too high, and still others believed that the governor was working hand in hand with the tribes, profiting at the expense of the colony itself. When Berkeley learned that Bacon was planning to lead a group of men into tribal lands, he put him in charge of the militia and ordered him to stop him. But Bacon refused. He quit his post and instead led a group of men into the wilderness. With him was the head of the man whose death had started it all. Berkeley immediately declared Bacon a rebel and ordered him arrested. But when a group of militia arrived at his house to make the arrest, they were beaten back. Bacon's supporters rose up across the colony. In April of 1676, he led his followers to the capital and demanded that Berkeley allow them to march into the West. When the governor refused, Bacon and his men seized control of Jamestown and forced Berkeley to flee. It was at this point that the rebellion got bloody. Several Berkeley supporters were killed, including the man who would have arrested Bacon. From there, Bacon and his men seized plantations in the countryside, killing anyone who supported the governor. As you can probably tell, things are about to get very complicated. But before we jump into the next episode, let's take a moment to hear a word from our sponsor. All right, let's get back to Bacon's rebellion. What happens next will shape the future of the Virginia colony. Did Bacon and his men win? You'll have to watch to find out. Okay, so before we continue, I want to let you know that the next episode won't be released until July. June is Pride Month, and I am taking the month to reflect on my own identity within the LGBTQ community and spend time with my family. I've struggled with depression and anxiety for most of my adult life, but since finding the right support, I've learned to manage it and live a happy, healthy life. Pride is important because it means that people like me can feel comfortable being ourselves. But for many people in the LGBTQ community, even today, it's not safe to be open about who they are. In some countries, it's illegal, and for those who do come out, many face discrimination, hatred, and violent. That's why I'm partnering with an organization this month. Their mission is to protect and care for those who are most vulnerable in the LGBTQ community. They help those experiencing homelessness, those who've been trafficked, and those facing criminal charges simply for being themselves. And that's where you come in. You can help provide food, clothing, and shelter to those in need and help fund life-saving advocacy and legal programs. It takes just $1 a day to change someone's life. Thank you for listening, and thank you for caring. Now, let's get back to the video. Upon seizing control of Jamestown, Bacon led his men to the nearest large plantation and began looting it. The owner tried to argue that he shouldn't be punished because he hadn't sold land to the settlers, only given them permission to hunt on his property, but Bacon wanted his head as well. And while all of this was happening, Berkeley was traveling north in an attempt to raise an army to retake the colony. By May, he'd made it to Maryland and raised a force of 300 men. With their help, he returned to Virginia in June and marched south to retake Jamestown. Meanwhile, Bacon divided his forces, sending some to stop Berkeley's advance, while others looted plantations along the James River. But the rebels suffered a major defeat at the Battle of Green Spring. Bacon was forced to flee to the eastern shore, where he fell ill and died in October. His head was cut off and hung from the bowsprit of the ship that had brought him to Virginia. Berkeley soon retook control of the colony and had many of Bacon's supporters put to death. But his victory was short-lived. Within 2 years, he was dead and the colony was on the verge of bankruptcy. We'll talk more about that in the next chapter. And as always, thank you for watching. Chapter 3, Nathaniel Bacon, the Ambitious Outsider. As we begin Chapter 3, there is one thing I want to establish right away, because it is going to be a point of contention for some of you, and that is this. This is not a biography of Nathaniel Bacon. I'm only going to cover Bacon's life up through 1676. After that, he goes down in history as one of the most hated men in North America and then dies in a hurricane. It was bad luck. If I wanted to do a biography of Nathaniel Bacon, I could probably get tenure at Berkeley College. But this isn't that story. Also, if you hate trigger warnings, fair warning. This episode contains trigger warnings. Okay, let's go. The year is 1645, and our story begins in the village of Great Ayton, in the county of Yorkshire, England, where our hero is born into relative obscurity. Growing up in England during the mid-1600s wasn't like growing up in England today. In fact, it sucked, especially if you were born into poverty. For most of English history, life had been pretty good if you were white, and preferably male. Sure, peasants got screwed over all the time, but for the most part, they had a roof over their heads, something to eat, and their odds of dying from disease or war were about the same as your odds of getting hit by lightning. But things started to change in the mid-1600s, when an economic depression known as the English Civil War kicked off. The war was between supporters of the king and supporters of Parliament. And guess which side won? Spoiler alert, it's not the supporters of the guy whose head is on the money. Anyway, following the outbreak of war, England's economy collapsed. Trade routes were disrupted. Inflation went through the roof, and food shortages became commonplace. Bacon Sr. moved his family around a lot to escape the worst of it, including to the city of Bristol, where Nathaniel attended grammar school. But the constant upheaval made life really hard for the Bacon family. As Nathaniel grew older, he followed his father into military service, but soon tired of that, to take up the study of law instead. He enrolled at Newen Hall in London, an inn that also served as a residence for students at the Middle Temple, one of the 4 legal societies in London. But by this point, civil war was raging across England, and Bacon left his studies to join his father on the battlefield. What did his father do? Well, here's the problem. We don't know. Nathaniel Bacon Sr. was in and around Bristol for much of the war, but the details are sketchy at best. Nathaniel Jr. would later put out a public notice asking anyone with information about his father's death to contact him, but nobody came forward with any answers. So we don't know exactly what happened. All we know is that Nathaniel Bacon Sr. died sometime before 1654, leaving young Nathaniel to return to civilian life and finish his legal studies. In 1656, Nathaniel Bacon graduated and was called to the bar, but his heart wasn't in it. Maybe all the fighting had worn him out. Or maybe he just didn't see the great opportunities in England. Whatever the reason, he packed up and headed to Virginia. Upon arriving in Virginia, Bacon began working as a surveyor, which may have been part of his training as a lawyer. But don't worry, he will soon switch to a more lucrative profession. As we've discussed in previous episodes, Colonial Virginia was a cash-strapped colony at this point. Royal officials had given up trying to fund the colony, and private investors had little interest in funding a colony that barely produced a profit. So the colony had very few resources to draw on for building schools or hiring teachers. Thus, at this point in time, being a lawyer in Virginia meant that you basically had to teach yourself the law. You could read English legal texts. Sure, and many people did that, but since books were expensive, most people simply absorbed legal knowledge through osmosis, while hanging out at taverns and talking with other lawyers. And that's exactly what Nathaniel Bacon did. He spent his days surveying land and his nights drinking and talking shop with other lawyers. During this time, he met a man named Robert Custis, who would become one of his lifelong friends, and later serve as the colony's attorney general. Bacon also became friendly with the colony's governor, William Berkeley, who appointed him to the local militia. On paper, Berkeley was Bacon's superior. In reality, though, the two men had a complicated relationship that would soon turn hostile. Like most men of the time, Bacon made his money primarily as a planter. He owned a large tract of land near the mouth of the James River, called Bacon's Castle. But unlike most planters, he didn't rely solely on growing tobacco. See, the trouble with tobacco is that it's a labor-intensive crop. Each plant must be tended to individually and constantly. That meant that most plantations relied heavily on indentured servants. But Bacon sought other ways to diversify his income. The most successful planters sold their crops directly to merchants in England, but that required loads of capital to ship enough tobacco across the Atlantic to make a profit. So most planters sold their crop to middlemen who shipped it to England. But even that required a lot of money up front. Thus, most planters took out loans to finance their operations, which is why so many of them became so enamored with gold. The dream was always to find a way to replace the middlemen and sell their product directly to Europe. If they could do that, they would finally break free from their dependence on England and truly become independent. Of course, the reality was that they would simply exchange one master for another, selling their crops to France or Spain instead. But still, the idea held a certain romantic appeal, especially for a young, ambitious man like Nathaniel Bacon. And ambition is one of the key words that we need to use when describing Nathaniel Bacon. When we look at Berkeley, we see a man who was willing to bend and adapt to circumstances in order to survive. When the Scions came to Virginia, he played along. When the English Civil War broke out, he remained neutral. When King Charles II returned to power, he swore fealty to the new regime. His life was one of careful pragmatism, of maximizing the good and minimizing the bad. But with Nathaniel Bacon, things were different. Bacon was like the kid sitting at the back of the classroom, drawing pictures of the teacher with horns. He couldn't help himself. He was an ambitious firebrand who thought that the world owed him something. When he came to Virginia, he expected advancement, and he expected it fast. When he applied to become the secretary of the colony, he was passed over in favor of a loyalist named Robert Custis. No big deal, right? Well, yes, it is a big deal. To understand how big of a deal it was, we have to understand that Bacon was used to being in charge. He was a former militia officer, after all, and serving as the secretary to the governor would have been a step down. So Bacon took what he could get and accepted a position on the governor's council, but he still felt slighted. And according to some accounts, he felt that his friend Custis was using his influence over Berkeley to keep him down. Bacon began to feel isolated within the colony's ruling class, and that isolation turned him into an outsider. Now, I should point out that being an outsider wasn't anything new for Bacon. Throughout his life, he'd been an outsider in England. He was born into poverty and couldn't afford to live the high life. And then he came to Virginia and quickly found that his credentials didn't hold much weight with the colony SLE. But while being an outsider was familiar to Bacon, being an outsider at the height of his powers was a whole new experience, and it turned him into a revolutionary. And I don't mean that he wanted to overthrow the government or anything like that. I just mean that he was no longer part of the ruling class. And when you're as ambitious as Nathaniel Bacon, that's a dangerous place to be. In a future episode, we'll discuss Bacon's rebellion. But for now, I'll simply say that Bacon found an outlet for his frustration in the colony's disaffected class. These were people who had come to the colony hoping for wealth and opportunity, and found themselves working long hours for little pay. They were tired of working for the rich, and they were ready for change. And who could deliver that change but the ambitious young lawyer with a chip on his shoulder? If you enjoy my content, please subscribe and leave a like. Doing those two things will help us reach our goal of 1 million subscribers by the end of the year. If you want to help me reach that goal, click the link in the description to learn how you can donate to our annual fundraiser. Our community of patrons are listed on our website. I'll see you next time. All right, it's time to finish up our tale of the American Revolution. So grab your powdered wigs and muskets, boys, and let us jump right into Chapter 4. Frontier Frustrations. The spark ignites. Last time we talked about how the British had just finished kicking the French out of North America once and for all. But that victory came at a cost. For while Britain was busy taking Canada, Spain, and France had to put up with their own problems in the colonies, the British government's primary focus was the war in the north, and they left the colonists more or less to their own devices. But now that peace had been restored, the government expected order to be brought back to the colonies, and that meant the frontier needed to be settled. But not everyone would be happy about this. In 1763, the same year that the French surrendered, the colonial governors were ordered to suppress the various Native American nations who were opposing the expansion of the colonies, and that included the mighty Powhatan Confederacy down here in Virginia. Now, the funny thing is, the Powhatan Confederacy had already been a big deal in these parts before the English even showed up. Their chiefdoms stretched from the fall line of the James River all the way up to the Chesapeake Bay, and they consisted of several dozen smaller tribes united under the banner of their paramount chief. But by the mid-1700s, the various tribes of the Confederacy were feeling pretty threatened. The English colonists were expanding rapidly, encroaching on tribal lands and hunting grounds, bringing diseases that devastated native populations, and most importantly, breaking treaties. Oh, boy, a lot of them broke. Now, over the last few decades, the tribes of the Confederacy had allied with the French and fought against the English in King William's War and the French and Indian War. But those alliances hadn't gone so well, and after the French defeat, the native nations found themselves fighting alone against the ever-encroaching colonists. The Powhatan had tried everything else. They sued for peace, but the colonists wanted more land. They appealed to the king, but he just ignored them. And they even tried assimilating into colonial society, but that didn't work either. So some of the tribes began raiding colonial settlements, and in retaliation, the colonists launched attacks of their own, and before long, the whole region descended into chaos. Now, there was one group in particular who hated the colonists almost as much as the natives. The Susquehannock people. These guys lived over here in now Maryland and Pennsylvania, and they were really salty about the colonists stealing their land and enslaving their people. You see, the Susquehannock were one of the largest and most powerful tribes in the area, but they were broken up into dozens of small autonomous villages, and thus had no one paramount chief to lead them. And since the native nations couldn't effectively unite to resist the colonists, they instead focused on petty squabbles with each other. That was until the 1750s, when two brothers named Neat and Seat prompted a series of successful raids against the Susquehannock people. Soon, many of the villages were being abandoned, and the Susquehannock were forced to flee into the wilderness, or submit to the colonists. Most submitted, but not all. A few groups remained free, including the one led by the aforementioned brothers, who were seeking revenge. Their first target was the Shenandoah Valley, where they ambushed a party of surveyors, but they soon found that attacking the isolated settlements was easy. The hard part was supplying their warriors. See, the Susquehannocks weren't a horde of nomadic horsemen like the ones we'll talk about later. No, they were a forest tribe who hunted and gathered like most Native Americans, and as such, they had to stay close to the rivers to fish and the fields to farm. So in order to wage war, they needed to establish bases near the front lines from which they could supply their troops. But any base they set up was almost immediately destroyed by colonial militia, and eventually the two brothers were captured and hanged by the militia. And with that, The major resistance in this part of the country was broken, but not everyone accepted the peace that followed. For many years, bands of Susquehannock and other tribes like the Dogue would launch hit-and-run attacks against the colonists. It was a frustrating existence for the settlers, who complained bitterly about the attacks to their leaders. The problem was their leaders, namely the royal governor of Virginia, Lord Dunmore, had little desire to do anything about it. See, Dunmore had his own agenda. He wanted the northern border of his colony to extend to the Ohio River. But in order to do that, he needed the approval of the colonial legislatures, and those legislatures were mostly made up of wealthy landowners who didn't want to spend their money protecting backwoods hunters. So Dunmore was stuck between a rock and a hard place. He couldn't expand west without the legislature's approval, but he couldn't get the legislature's approval without suppressing the natives. And because of the French and Indian War, he didn't have an army to do the job, so he did the only thing he could. He asked the British government for help. Now, you might remember that when the peace treaty was signed in 1763, the British government ordered the colonial governors to suppress the natives. But by 1764, nothing had happened. The Susquehannock had proven to be elusive fighters, and the royal governor of Virginia was hesitant to expend his limited resources trying to hunt them down. But that didn't mean he wasn't willing to try. He sent an officer named Robert Dinwiddie to negotiate a peace treaty with the tribes. Dinwiddie and his two companions traveled deep into the wilderness to meet with the tribal leaders. But midway through the journey, they were attacked by a band of natives and killed. The attackers were never identified, but suspicion fell on the Dogue tribe, who had been fighting alongside the Sioux. And when Dunmore heard about the incident, he knew exactly how to use it. He told the colonial legislature that the Doe were responsible, and that only a massive military campaign could stop them. He wanted 3,000 men to be raised and sent into the wilderness to hunt them down. Now, the legislators weren't keen on sending that many men on such a dangerous mission, especially for something that might not even happen again. They offered to double the pay of the colonial militia to 10 shillings a day, but that didn't work. So then they offered to triple it to 30 shillings a day. Still, Dunmore wanted 3,000 men, but if the legislators wouldn't raise them, he would raise them himself. In the summer of 1764, he commissioned a former British officer named Joshua Fry to raise a force of 3,000 Virginians and lead them on a punitive expedition into the wilderness. To us, East Dunmore also dispatched a British regular named John Smith, along with a detachment of artillery and rangers. Dunmore hoped that the threat of artillery and the knowledge that they were fighting alongside experienced British soldiers would convince the legislators to pony up the cash for the rest of the force. But it didn't. So with only 300 men, Fry set off into the wilderness in search of the Doe. The settlers who had petitioned Dunmore to take action watched them go and waited for the inevitable attack. It didn't come. After months of searching, Fry and Smith failed to find the Doe and were forced to return to Virginia empty. The settlers were furious. They accused Dunmore of purposely mishandling the expedition to avoid doing anything, and demanded that he call the Virginia Convention. Dunmore didn't want to do that, but he had no choice. On November 1st, 1764, the convention met and voted to raise a new militia force to deal with the natives once and for all. This time, though, they put Colonel John Chiswell in charge of the expedition. Chiswell was a veteran of the French and Indian War and had the full support of the colonial legislature. With that, he assembled a force of 800 men and marched them into the wilderness to wipe out the Doe. But he had barely penetrated the wilderness when his men began to die. Disease and dwindling supplies forced him to abandon the mission and return to the settlement. Meanwhile, news of the failure of the first two expeditions spread throughout the colonies. It seemed as if every time the colonists attempted to deal with the natives, things got worse, and nobody could understand why. Landowners in the South didn't want to risk their money protecting the hunters in the West, and the hunters in the West didn't want to risk their lives defending the landowners in the East. All across the colonies, people were growing tired of being ruled by a government that refused to protect them. Little did they know that soon they would have a chance to do something about it. Hey everyone, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and leave a like or comment. Also, be sure to check out our new channel. We just posted a video on the Battle of Quebec, and I'm the host. I'll see you next time. Alright, we're back to the year 1754 and North America. It's time for Chapter 5. where we find out what happens when British colonial officials have to balance treaty obligations with popular opinion. But before we get started, if you haven't already, please consider hitting that subscribe button down below to help me keep making these videos. Now then, picking up where we left off, William Shirley is dead, having kicked the bucket in Boston just after Christmas in 1753. And his old position as governor of Massachusetts Bay is still vacant. So, in February of 1754, the Lords of Trade formally appointed Thomas Pownall as the new governor of Massachusetts Bay. While he's packing his bags for New England, though, the Lords of Trade decided to send him on a little side quest first. He was also supposed to swing by South Carolina on the way and take over the governorship there, too. So now he's got 2 colonies to govern from his base in Charleston, which is why in April he wrote this letter to the governor of Virginia asking him to help collect taxes from the settlers in the backcountry. Apparently, the last tax collector had gotten so frustrated at being shot at by natives that he just packed up and left town without collecting anything. So Pownall wanted someone to go back there and try again, and who better than the recently knighted and very eager to please Royal Governor Robert Dinwiddie. The resulting treaty would make Dinwiddie the first president of the colony of Virginia. We'll get to all of that in due time. For now, though, let's focus on our buddy James Oglethorpe, the original founder of the colony of Georgia, who has just returned from England after dealing with a whole mess of problems created by the Scots who settled in his colony. You see, Oglethorpe was always worried about the threat posed by Spain to his colony of Georgia, so he'd gone to London to lobby the government to allow him to fortify the colony. In particular, he wanted permission to build a fort at the mouth of the Savannah River to block any attempt by the Spanish to sail upriver and attack the city of Savannah. Well, Parliament agreed, but they were pretty clear that building a fort was not to be considered a permanent solution. The best answer to the Spanish threat, they said, was to help the colony grow and prosper so that the British would be more likely to want to defend it. So Parliament agreed to fund the construction of Fort George at the mouth of the Savannah, but only if Oglethorpe could raise half the cost of building it himself. Now, as we saw in Chapter 2, Oglethorpe had already spent a lot of his own money helping the colony survive its first few years. So he asked the wealthy John Reynolds to front him the money instead. Reynolds agreed and even offered to come down to Georgia and oversee construction of the fort himself. As Reynolds and Oglethorpe planned the construction of the fort, they realized that Oglethorpe didn't actually have the authority to turn over the building of a fort to anyone else, even a fellow member of the Board of Trustees. That responsibility, they discovered, belonged to the Crown. So Reynolds went back to England to ask the king to formally appoint him as deputy governor of Georgia, so that he could oversee construction of the fort. While Reynolds was gone, though, Oglethorpe died unexpectedly. So upon his return to Georgia, Reynolds found himself reporting to a new governor, Henry Ellis. Governor Ellis was pretty cool with all of this, though, and allowed Reynolds to finish his work on the fort. So eventually, in December of 1736, Fort George was finally completed. But just 3 years later, the British government decided to pull the plug on the colony of Georgia. They accused the Board of Trustees of mismanaging the colony and failing to meet the goals set out by the charter. So in 1749, King George II revoked the charter and made the colony a part of the province of South Carolina. But it was a bit of a weird transition. See, the Board of Trustees still owned a bunch of land within what's now the state of Georgia, and they didn't fully turn that land over to South Carolina until 1751. So, from 1736 to 1751, there was this awkward situation where a chunk of South Carolina was stuck in between 2 royal colonies. And since Oglethorpe was technically still the governor of Georgia, he was responsible for defending this chunk of South Carolina. And we know that defending the colony was really important to him, which brings us to our final protagonist for this chapter, James Glenn. James Glenn was an ambitious young Scottish Highlander who came to America in the 1730s and became one of the founders of the colony of Georgia. As such, he was a member of the elite party of proprietors who received large tracts of land in exchange for their help in founding the colony. But while Glenn had enough money to live comfortably in Savannah, he much preferred the frontier, so he moved to the backcountry and built a fort there. Glenn was a good friend of James Oglethorpe and shared his dream of defending Georgia against the Spanish. So when Oglethorpe needed someone to defend this disputed territory, he put Glenn in charge. But Glenn wasn't like Ogle. He didn't want to build forts or attract settlers to the colony. He just wanted to go to war. Now, to be fair, there was definitely a reason to go to war. Throughout the 1740s and 50s, the southern colonies experienced a surge in violence coming from various Native American tribes, but for the most part, the violence seemed to be in response to colonial expansion, rather than any kind of organized effort to stop it. And the vast majority of the time, the natives who attacked colonial settlements were members of the Cherokee Nation. But the Cherokees weren't a single tribe, but rather a collection of independent communities bound together by cultural similarities. This meant that the colonists couldn't simply negotiate with the Cherokees as a whole, but instead had to deal with each community individually. Unfortunately, many of those communities were led by men like Attakullakulla, also known to the colonists as the Great Warrior. Attakullakulla was a staunch ally of the French and a determined opponent of colonial expansion. His goal was to unite the various Cherokee communities into a single political entity that could stand up to the colonists, and so far, he was doing a pretty good job of it. In 1752, the colonial governors met with the leaders of the Six Nations near Albany and negotiated a treaty that established a line of trade along the Appalachian Mountains that would keep the colonists and the natives happy. But when Attakullakulla heard about the treaty, he called the Cherokee leaders together and told them that they needed to reject it. Attakullakulla believed that the only way to stop the colonists was to force them to abandon their settlements in the Ohio Valley, and he convinced most of the Cherokee chiefs to agree with him. Then in 1754, things really started to go badly for the colonists. First, a group of traders traveling through the Ohio Valley were attacked by a band of warriors loyal to Attakullakulla, and they managed to escape by hiding in a cave. Soon, news of this attack reached the Virginia governor, Robert Dinwiddie, who immediately sent an order to James Glenn demanding that he march to the Ohio Valley and teach the natives a lesson. Glenn was reluctant to do this, though, because he feared that a full-scale war with the Cherokees would devastate the colony's economy. Instead, he wanted to bide his time and wait for the right moment to strike. In the meantime, tensions continued to rise. Another group of traders was attacked, this time by a large group of warriors, and when they escaped, they reported seeing British soldiers in the village where the attack had taken place. Naturally, this enraged the colonists, and they demanded that Glenn do something about it. But Glenn refused, saying that he wasn't sure if the soldiers were British or French, and he didn't want to start a war over nothing. Meanwhile, across the colonies, people were starting to get really angry at the repeated attacks by the natives. When the news of the latest attack reached Charleston, the local militia seized all the trading canoes in the harbor and prevented any more trade with the natives. Then, a delegation from the Six Nations arrived in Charleston to protest the seizure of the canoes and demand that the colonists release the trader they had captured during the attack. But the colonists wouldn't budge, and the natives were forced to leave empty-handed. Back in Georgia, this outraged the Cherokee leader, who immediately went to war against the colony. But before we can see how Glenn responds to this crisis, we'll have to wait until next time. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and leave me a comment to let me know what you thought. If you want to learn more about the French and Indian War, check out my series, The Road to the Revolution, available exclusively on a streaming service. Chapter 6. Bacon Takes Action Without Permission. We're continuing our series on the most badass people in history, and today we're going to talk about Nathaniel Bacon, who was a colonist from Virginia that led an unauthorized militia against Native Americans, and then went on to burn down the capital of Virginia before he died from dysentery while being pursued by British troops. As we talked about in Chapter 4, things were really bad in Virginia by the end of 1675. The House of Burgesses had made peace with the various tribes, which angered many of the frontier settlers who wanted war. This group would rally around Nathaniel Bacon, who was the son of one of the richest men in Virginia. Even though he had more to lose than just about anyone else, Bacon took action into his own hands. He organized a group of men and crossed the James River into the lands of the Monohoke people. Here he found the village of a chief named Poxon. We have to assume that Bacon knew exactly what he was doing, because the first thing he did was set up an ambush, kill Coxon, and burn his village to the ground. He then moved west and attacked another village belonging to a chief named Nordamo, but he too was defeated. Bacon and his men then returned to Jamestown, where they recruited more men for their militia. They also received supplies from some sympathetic settlers, and then they headed north to attack the Chickahominy tribe. Here they ambushed another village, killing the chief, and they also captured a lot of women and children. They then continued following the river until they came across a large village belonging to a powerful chief named Opian. Like the other villages, this one was also attacked, and again, the chief was killed. But Bacon's men were almost defeated. Only 200 of them managed to escape the battle with their lives. They were forced to leave the area and retreat back to Jamestown, where they were welcomed like heroes. Bacon had now proven himself to be a great warrior, and many of the colonists supported him despite the fact that he had committed multiple acts of violence without permission from the governor. In fact, when he entered Jamestown, he had a crowd of supporters waiting for him, and they began to chant, "Give us tobacco." This was a reference to how the colony had been paying the Native Americans for tobacco that they used as currency. Now, they wanted it for free. And so Governor Berkeley, who was Bacon's biggest rival, ordered the town's warehouses to be opened so everyone could help themselves. Berkeley probably hoped that this would win Bacon over to his side, but instead, it only fueled the hatred between the two men. When Bacon heard about the order, he said, "Governor Berkeley is afraid I shall spoil his trade," which is exactly what he intended to do. There was no way Berkeley would ever allow him to attack the tribes to the north, so Bacon was going to take matters into his own hands and force him out of office. And so after stopping at a tavern for some drinks, he led his men through the swamps to the north. There they ambushed a party of Indians who were returning home from a trip to the south. Among the prisoners they took was a woman who had been taken captive during a previous raid. She was now being returned to her family, but Bacon insisted that she stay with him. This was something of a turning point in the story. It showed that Bacon was not only a ruthless killer, but he was also willing to break the law, and there was nothing the governor could do to stop him. This is why when Bacon heard that Berkeley was sending troops to chase him down, he just laughed. He knew that Berkeley would never risk angering the colonists by committing violence against them, and so he decided to make his stand in the capital itself. He left the river and marched his men toward Jamestown. His goal was to seize the gunpowder stores, which would give him the power to attack the British soldiers. On the way, he stopped at a fort that had been built by a wealthy landowner named Robert Custis. Fort Custis was located on a peninsula surrounded by water on 3 sides. To reach the 4th side, which was protected by palisades, one had to cross a drawbridge. Bacon sent some men to guard the bridge, and then he went to the top of the fort with a few others to wait for the British troops. As they watched, they saw Berkeley and his men approaching the fort. When they got close enough, Bacon fired his musket, which kicked up a lot of dust and smoke. Everyone looked up to see what had happened, and that's when the rest of Bacon's men opened fire. The British suffered heavy casualties and had to retreat. The next day, Bacon led his men on an attack against the capital. He and his men stormed out the city's gates, and then they joined forces with a group of armed colonists who had been waiting inside. The rebels quickly seized control of the city, and Bacon went to Berkeley's house to arrest him. When the governor heard what was happening, he fled with his wife and a few servants. They boarded a ship and escaped across the James River. Meanwhile, Bacon was proclaimed the new governor by his supporters, and he wasted no time in taking advantage of his new position. He immediately confiscated the goods of the wealthiest colonists, and then he distributed them to those who had suffered losses during the attacks from the tribes. He also imposed a tax on all land and exports, and he declared that all slaves caught outside at night would be killed. Then he appointed loyal men to run the government, such as Philip Ludwell, who became secretary of the colony. Unfortunately, Bacon wasn't able to enjoy his victory for long. Dysentery had been following his troops the entire time, and he soon became very sick. He spent several days in bed recovering from surgery, and then he died. The exact cause of death is unknown, but it was likely related to complications from the operation, or something he ate. After he did, Ludwell took charge and led the colony until Berkeley returned with military support from England. As we discussed in Chapter 5, this led to the Anglo-Powhatan War, which resulted in the defeat of the tribes and the establishment of British dominance in Virginia. But this is where our story gets interesting. You see, when Bacon's men seized Jamestown, they didn't just arrest Berkeley. They also arrested Edmund Custis, who was the wealthiest man in Virginia. Custis had remained loyal to the crown during the rebellion, so Bacon's men took him to the town square and executed him. Then, after Bacon died, his widow demanded that the secretary repay her husband's loan of £300, but when she went to collect the money, She was told that Custis had already spent it on public works projects, so she turned to the governor and demanded compensation for her loss. Berkeley refused and claimed that she should be grateful he hadn't executed her for treason. This led to a lawsuit that lasted several years, and eventually the Virginia General Court ruled that the colony had to pay her back. For a while, it seemed like Bacon had won, even in death. But this didn't last long. When Berkeley returned to power, he began arresting the people who had supported the rebellion. He executed dozens of them and sent others to prison. But he didn't stop there. He also began persecuting the family members of Bacon and confiscating their property. In fact, he even put Bacon's brother on trial for treason. The evidence against him was weak. But Berkeley didn't care. He wanted to make an example out of anyone who had supported the rebellion. Fortunately, he was unsuccessful in this goal, because most of Bacon's supporters were able to flee to England and escape prosecution. Berkeley remained in power until his death in 1682. But he never really recovered from the humiliation of being driven out of the capital by Bacon's men. In fact, he even called Bacon a rebel in his will. So let's end this video by talking about how Bacon became a rebel. Like we mentioned earlier, he wasn't a poor man, so he had little to gain by attacking the tribes. In fact, he likely lost more than anyone else when his crops were burned and his animals were killed. This means we have to look at the motivations behind his actions, and the most likely explanation is that he was a product of his environment. Remember, this was a time when the Virginia colony was struggling to survive. The growing season was short, so food was scarce. There was also a lot of competition for land, and the colonists felt like the British government wasn't protecting them. So when Bacon learned that the tribes had killed a friend of his, he took it upon himself to get revenge. This led to his first attack on the Monahawk people. Then he kept going because each victory brought him more fame and power. Before long, he had become a local hero to the frontier settlers who were tired of being ignored by the British government. In fact, these people probably saw him as the only leader who cared about their interests, and so when he marched on Jamestown, they supported him, despite knowing that he was a murderer. This shows that Bacon wasn't just a criminal. He was also a populist who appealed to the common man. He stood for everything the colonists had been denied: freedom, land, and security. And so, it is not surprising that he was able to raise an army of 1,000 men and capture the capital. He gave voice to the voiceless and promised to protect them from the dangers of the frontier. But he was also willing to use violence and intimidation to achieve his goals. After seizing Jamestown, he became a dictator who persecuted his opponents and took their property. So was Nathaniel Bacon a hero or a villain? Well, that depends on your point of view. If you were a wealthy landowner who benefited from the British colonial system, then Bacon was a dangerous rebel who needed to be stopped. If, however, you were a frontier settler who had been ignored by the government, then Bacon was a champion who fought for your rights. In the end, he may have lost the war, but he won the hearts and minds of the common people, and that's why he became a legend that lived on for centuries. Thank you for watching. Please follow if you haven't already, and remember to like, share, and comment to help us grow. Thanks. Bye. Nathaniel Bacon was now in full rebellion against William Berkeley, and after burning down the town of Jamestown, Bacon turned his attention to the capital at Williamsburg, though he didn't exactly know what he would do when he got there. So this is part 3 of our series, where we are reading and summarizing the Virginia Company, a colony in the making by historian James Horn. And in part 1, we covered chapters 1 through 3, which took us from the founding of the colony of Virginia in 1607 up to the arrival of the first real governor, Sir Francis Wyatt, in 1629. In part 2, we covered chapters 4 through 6, which took us from the Anglo-Powhatan War up to Nathaniel Bacon's burning of Jamestown. And in this part, we're going to cover chapter 7, The Rebellion Spreads. So if you've already watched those 2 videos or if you've read the book, then let's go ahead and get into it. As Bacon made his way toward Williamsburg, he was joined by many who wanted to see the end of William Berkeley's rule. And while the book doesn't go into great detail about this, one can only imagine the sights that must have greeted the people coming out of Jamestown. There must have been a lot of destruction, but also a lot of personal stories of loss. People whose homes had been burned to the ground, people who had lost family members, or perhaps even their entire life savings. But there were also probably quite a few people who were not sad to see Jamestown destroyed. There were certainly some within the town itself who would have welcomed the chance for a fresh start, perhaps with a new leader, especially those who had been opposed to Bacon's rebellion. But as the travelers neared Williamsburg, they could see that preparations were being made for defense. When Bacon arrived, there were an estimated 3,000 able-bodied men in the city, including 1,500 militia. They had blocked off the main roads into the city and built several barricades. These included 2 strong forts near the gates to the city. One was named after the English king, Charles II, and the other was named for the royal Governor Berkeley. On top of these 2 forts were several smaller ones that were manned by citizen soldiers. Upon seeing this, Bacon stopped about 5 miles outside of town and sent a letter to Berkeley demanding that he'd be given a commission in the militia so that he could fight the common enemy, which of course at the time was the Native Americans. He said that he could unattack the fort because he was an uncommissioned officer and therefore could lead troops in an offensive action. Now, of course, Bacon had been leading troops in offensive actions for weeks, but this was a way of putting things so that he could demand a commission without having to admit that he was already in charge of the military forces. Berkeley refused him this commission, however, and Bacon responded by saying that since he wasn't going to be given a commission, he was going to march on the city and overthrow the government. At this point, he had about 800 men with him. Berkeley responded by saying that he would give Bacon a commission, but he had to lay down his arms. Bacon declined this offer, saying that he wouldn't lay down his arms until he got a commission. Then supposedly, Bacon told the citizens of Williamsburg that they would soon have an opportunity to choose between submission and ruin. Then, early the next morning, Bacon and his men started their attack. Now, according to the book, there were some reports that one of Bacon's men fired a musket at the English fort, but the truth of this is hard to verify. What we do know is that after this supposed shot was fired, the rebels attacked the barricades, and for 3 hours, they fought with the militia. Now, the fighting was fierce, but the book says that it was mostly a shouting match rather than an actual battle. As the day wore on, more and more farmers, indentured servants and laborers came into town and joined the militia, and this caused the tide of battle to turn against the rebels. So Bacon withdrew his men and spent the night camped out in the woods. The next day, he tried again, but with the same result. The people of Williamsburg repelled his attacks, and Bacon once again had to withdraw his men. After this, Bacon decided to lay siege to the city. And while his men dug trenches and prepared to stay for the long haul, word came back to him that a large relief force was on the way. So with no choice but to either stay and starve or to run and live another day, Bacon decided to lift the siege and retreat. And in fact, that's exactly what he did. He retreated to the east, moving along the James River. His goal was to get to a place called Bloody Bush, which was the last place where he and his brother had defeated the Native Americans. He hoped that he might be able to rally more support there, and he also hoped that he might be able to get supplies from his own farm, which was located nearby. On the way, though, he encountered yet another group of militia, and this one was even larger than the one at Williamsburg. There were about 3,500 militia ready to stop him. Now, once again, this really could have been the end of the rebellion. Most people would have just surrendered at this point, but Bacon was desperate, and so he attacked. And once again, he used the high ground to make his stand. This was an open field, and on the far side of it was a small hill. Bacon and his men climbed the hill and fired down upon the militia below them. This worked very well, and they drove the militia back. Then they did something quite unexpected. They set up camp and spent the night right there in the middle of the field. This was most likely done so that they could keep watch over the militia and prevent any nighttime attack. But it may have also been a way to show the militia that they weren't going anywhere, that they weren't going to surrender. And so they spent the night there, watching each other. In the morning, Bacon again attacked and pushed the militia back. But then he made a critical mistake. His men were low on powder, so he ordered them to fire only once, just one shot each, before reloading. And this proved to be disastrous. The militia had expected to drive the rebels away, but instead, they had to stop and regroup. And by the time they got back into position, the rebels were gone. They had retreated into the forest and disappeared. Now, all throughout this conflict, Berkeley had been desperately trying to get help from England, but he hadn't gotten much in the way of response. You see, England at the time was involved in the Anglo-Dutch War, and so they were stretched thin. Besides, they thought that the rebellion was a relatively minor issue and that Berkeley could handle it on his own. And finally, they weren't all that interested in sending troops to such a minor colony. But at this point, They realized that they needed to put someone in charge of the colony who could actually do the job. And so they sent over Edmund Custis to take charge. But when he arrived, he found that Bacon had taken charge of the entire colony. And so this brings us to the end of Chapter 7. Next time, we'll cover Chapters 8 and 9, which will bring us to the end of Part 3. If you want to read along, then feel free to pick up a copy of the book. We'll have a link in the description below. If you enjoyed this episode, then please hit that like button and consider subscribing. Also, if you'd like to help out with these videos, then please consider supporting us. We'll have a link to that in the description as well. Thank you for watching. This is Chapter 8. Burning of Jamestown from the book, The Burnie, the story of Bacon's Rebellion, America's First. The wind snatched at Captain Thomas Graves' S-beard as he stood on the bank of the James River. His head craned like a curious bird's to take in the scene before him. He could not believe what he was seeing. Flames licked hungrily at the sky, turning night into day. Their glow was reflected back at him from the river where the image of hell was mirrored above and below. The fire had come suddenly and spread quickly. Graves had been watching the English town of Jamestown just across the river from his camp, and he had seen it go up in flames. With naught he could do about it, all he could do was watch and wonder how in the world such a thing had happened. On September, Nathaniel Bacon Jr., leader of the rebels, had sent out 2 companies of men to burn the town. It wasn't that they were particularly good at their jobs. The English garrison there simply weren't prepared for an attack, and Bacon was clever enough to see to it that no one would be coming to relieve them. He'd taken all the boats across the river when he launched the attack on the town itself. So when the English garrison sounded the alarm, no help was coming. By the time the first ship might have arrived, Jamestown was nothing but ashes. As Captain Graves stood there staring, some of his men joined him, their faces pale, their eyes wide with the shock of it. Lieutenant Thomas Holmes, one of the soldiers, spoke finally, breaking the silence. Who could have done this? Who would do this? He gestured toward the flickering light show of destruction. No civilized people would burn another's house without warning. There had been warnings, but not from Bacon. It had come from one of the townspeople. A Mr. Giles, who ran a tavern in Jamestown, had strolled over to the garrison a few days earlier, looking uncharacteristically grim. He told the officers he was afraid that some of the townspeople meant to destroy the place. In fact, he said, he believed the plan had already been set into motion. He'd heard talk in the tavern, talk among the servants of the militia about burning the town, about killing every last Englishman in it. He'd thought it idle boasting at first, the sort of thing that men did to puff themselves up. But then he'd overheard more. This time the talk was of gathering together provisions and other things needed to set fires, to burn down the town. Giles had tried to get the officers to arrest the men he'd heard talking, but they'd paid no heed. They'd laughed at him and sent him away. And now look at the results. Damn fools, Graves muttered, shaking his head. A young officer named Philip Ludwell clapped Graves on the shoulder. Don't blame yourself, sir. We all thought it boastful bluster as well. Graves knew the man was right, but still he couldn't shake off the feeling that they should have listened to Giles. He looked again at the raging fire and saw something else. In the heart of the flames sat Bacon's house, or, rather, where his house had been. Now, nothing but blackened timbers marked the spot. His own house had gone too. Everything he owned was lost. His thoughts flew to his wife, Elizabeth, and the children. Were they all right? Had they got away? He turned to run toward his boat, but Holmes caught his arm. "Where are you going, sir?" "To find my family," Graves said, pulling away from Holmes's grasp. "I must find them." But Holmes shook his head. "You can't. There's nothing left there now. You have to come with me. We have to report to Colonel Custis." Graves felt a surge of anger. Anger at his fate. Anger at the stupidity of the officers who had let this happen. He didn't want to obey, but he knew he must. As he walked away from the ruins of Jamestown, he risked one more glance back. Though the flames seemed to dance merrily in the night, he could see that they were dying down. Soon, all that would be left would be smoldering ruins. When he reached Col Custis, he learned that his wife and children had indeed escaped. She'd taken shelter with others in a church, which had also burned, but everyone was safe, or so they thought. Custis was furious. He wanted to lead a party out to search for Bacon, to kill him if he could. Graves knew Bacon was long gone by then, but he didn't know that Custis didn't know it. So he said, "It'll be useless, sir. Bacon will have taken to the woods. We may never find him." And so it proved. Bacon slipped through the officer's fingers time and time again. Each time Custis thought he had him trapped, Bacon managed to escape. Meanwhile, the officers continued to bicker amongst themselves about who was to blame for the loss of their town. Custis blamed the governor. The governor blamed the council. The council blamed the militia officers. The militia officers blamed the governor. Graves watched it all with growing weariness. None of them seemed able to understand why Bacon had done what he did. Graves understood perfectly. One evening, while sitting alone by his campfire, he was roused from his thoughts by the approach of a stranger. The man introduced himself as Robert Parker and explained that he was one of Bacon's officers. He'd been sent, he said, to find out if any stragglers from Jamestown had made it across the river. If they had, he said, and if they were friendly, he wanted to know if they could send someone to parley with Bacon. "You seem to assume that we would do that," Graves said. Parker flushed. "Well, perhaps I did, but I heard you were friends with Bacon, that you understood him." Graves threw a stick into the fire, watching its progress with fascination. "I do understand him." A sighed softly, "And I tell you, he means to destroy us all." "What?" Parker sprang to his feet, knocking over his chair. "Is that true? Does he mean it?" "Yes, he does. And the worst of it is, he's quite capable of doing it." Parker scrambled to light a fire of his own. "When the flames caught hold," he said, "I must ride back as fast as I can. Perhaps if we can catch him in time, we can stop him." Graves shook his head. "No, you can't. It's too late. I've seen his followers. They're coming here. He's right behind them." When Parker had gone, Graves returned to watching his fire. Soon enough, he saw the glow of torches bobbing in the distance. They came closer, and he saw that they were indeed carrying torches. Some of them were armed with swords and muskets. One carried a red flag emblazoned with a pitchfork. As they drew closer, Graves rose to meet them. Among them, he saw men he knew. There was John West, who had been quartermaster under Bacon, and Samuel Hearn, who had been one of the rebels' most trusted officers. Graves stepped forward. "Where is he?" he asked, knowing full well they wouldn't tell him. West's head. "Where is what?" "Bacon," Graves said, keeping his voice even. "Where's Bacon?" Hearn grinned. "Can't say I know what you're talking about." Graves wasn't fooled, but he knew he'd get nothing from these men. Instead, he asked them, "Do you think he'll be successful? Do you really think he can win?" They both exchanged glances. 10 West Side. "Why don't you join us, Graves? Come and fight for the king." Graves shook his head. "No, I fought for the king once, and I was loyal to him until I was slandered and exiled from his service. I have no wish to serve a crown that turns on those who serve it well." Samuel Harney stepped forward, his face twisted with hate. "So you stand with the traitors? Well, then you'll die with them." He lunged at Graves with a dagger. Graves sidestepped him easily, letting Harney pass. Then he took the man down with a swift kick to the knee. Harney cried out in pain and fell forward onto his face. Graves put his sword to the man's throat. "That's the thanks I get for my loyalty," he said bitterly. Harney spat at him. "You're a traitor. You deserve worse than death." "Perhaps I do," Graves said, "but I won't get it from you." He released Harney and let him scramble away. To his surprise, West made as though to follow, but changed his mind at the last moment. "You may live," Graves said, "but I suggest you leave this place and never darken the threshold of Virginia again." When West didn't answer, Graves laid a hand on the man's shoulder and pushed him toward the torches. "Go on, get out of here." West hesitated, then allowed himself to be swept along with the others. Graves watched them go, then looked back toward the fading flames of Jamestown. The sight of the burning town had frightened him, but the knowledge that Bacon was alive filled him with a deeper chill. He knew the rebel leader meant what he said. He intended to destroy them all, and Graves feared that he might succeed. Nathaniel Bacon Jr. surveyed the glowing ruin of Jamestown from the bank of the river. Across the way, the glow of campfires flickered like dying embers. He knew those fires belonged to the men he'd sent out to burn the town. He could hear their laughter echoing across the water. Their job was done. The English fort was nothing but ashes. He turned away and rode his horse inland. He didn't know exactly where he was going. The truth was, he didn't much care. He was tired, but not tired enough to sleep. Not yet. He urged his horse into a faster pace, urging it on with a sharp cut of his whip. Let them sleep, he thought. Let them dream their silly dreams of conquest. Let them think they've won. He smiled grimly. They haven't begun to win. Not by a long shot. In the morning, they would wake to find that everything had changed. And by nightfall, he said with a sudden conviction, they'll be running for their lives. Hey everybody! Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate your support. If you've enjoyed this episode, please share it with others. That really helps us out. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please do. That way you'll get notified each time we upload a new episode. Until next time, remember, freedom is scary. Deal with it. I'll see you in the next episode. Chapter 9. Bacon's hangover. So, at this point, the country was in open revolt against King Charles I. The parliamentary army had seized London. Most of the country was under the rebels' control, and for all intents and purposes, it seemed as though the king was defeated. This is not to say that England was about to become a democracy or anything like that. That wasn't going to happen for a long time. But this was supposed to be a coup by a bunch of nobles who wanted to reform the government. But even their plans were much more moderate than simply executing the king. They just wanted him to recognize their supremacy. And Bacon wasn't interested in that. And so he briefly seized the throne for himself and became Lord Protector of the realm until, he got sick and died. How did that happen? Well, we have to talk about what happened in the immediate aftermath of the coup. Right after he deposed Charles, Bacon tried to secure his position by getting married. He had been married before, but that marriage had been annulled because his wife couldn't produce an heir. So he married Elizabeth, the widow of one of his co-conspirators, Sir Thomas Bridges, who had been killed during the siege of Colchester. Now, this new marriage didn't really help his popularity, because the rumor was that he was only marrying her to get his hands on her dowry. And indeed, when he took her to see the Queen Mother, Lady Eleanor, Bacon told her that he was only marrying Elizabeth for her money. So yeah, that went well. Bacon also appointed 2 of his friends to the Privy Purse, which gave them control over royal funds, and he began extorting the nobility. In order to keep them on his side, he demanded money from everyone, including the Queen Mother. To his credit, he did use some of that money to fund the parliamentary army, which was besieging Oxford, where the young Prince of Wales, later Charles II, had taken refuge with a bunch of royalist troops. After a 5-week siege, the city fell and Bacon entered triumphantly on June 28, 1646. According to one chronicler, the citizens turned out in force to welcome him. But what was probably more important was that most of the members of Parliament also showed up to greet him. Afterward, Parliament established a committee to run the country, while Bacon went off to deal with the royalist threat in the northwest. But the next day, he started feeling ill. One version of events says that he developed a fever after being caught in the rain, but nobody knows for sure. What we do know is that he rode back to London to see his doctor, Robert Wood, and then went to Greenwich to stay with friends. By July, it was clear that he was dying, and instead of returning to London to die in familiar surroundings, he decided to go back to his house in Essex. On July, as he lay dying, he sent for 2 advisors, Sir Thomas Littleton and Sir Robert Heath, along with his physician. Over the course of the next few days, they watched as he wasted away from dysentery, a severe infection of the intestines. As he approached death, he grew introspective, realizing that his gamble had failed. 3 weeks earlier, he had written a letter to the Parliament Speaker, William Pym, begging him to stop the war and restore the monarchy. But Parliament rejected his pleas, and so now he died a traitor, although many members of Parliament felt guilty about it and wished things could have turned out differently. Robert Heath wrote of Bacon's passing. His disease increased upon him, and he grew very weak, and could not speak, nor yet away at any time. In the night he had a surfeit, vomiting and purging, which did continue all the night, and the next day, and all that night following. And then he departed this life, the 18th of July, 1647. His body was buried in St. Michael's Church in his village of High Easter, near the grave of his first wife and children. No monument was ever erected to him, though his name survives on a plaque in the tower of the church. It was quite the end for a man who had harbored ambitions to be king. But, as I've said before, it's worth remembering that Oliver Cromwell is also dead. So is Henry VIII. Even Richard III, one of the last Plantagenets, met his demise at the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485. Ambition is a heady draught. We can see why these men sought power and glory, but we can also see how their ends were hastened by their own hubris. In the case of Bacon, his supporters were already losing steam by the time he led his army into London. After all, it was the Londoners themselves who opened the gates for him. Many of them had lost faith in King Charles and welcomed Bacon as a liberator, but others hated Bacon's guts and never wanted him to be Lord Protector. These people included John Lilbourne, leader of the London Citizens' Militia, who despised Bacon for opposing the execution of Charles I. At the time of the coup, there were rumors that Bacon had no intention of installing the Rump Parliament as the governing body of England. Instead, he wanted to set up a council of nobles to run the country. Now, the trouble with that plan was that the Rump Parliament was made up of about 140 members, whereas Bacon's council would have had around 20 or maybe 30. And the thing was, most of those 20 or 30 nobles weren't even in London. They were with the Parliamentary Army, besieging Oxford. So if Bacon hadn't gotten sick and died, he would have had to contend with the fact that most of the people who supported his coup were not actually interested in him being Lord Protector. They wanted the power for themselves. But perhaps all of this speculation is missing the point. Maybe Bacon wasn't really trying to be Lord Protector at all. Perhaps his goal was always to be king. Think about it. When he marched on London, he was greeted by crowds waving white handkerchiefs. But he barely acknowledged them. He wasn't interested in popular support. His focus was on seizing the royal palace and the treasury, and he appointed his friends to collect taxes from the populace. Once he declared himself Lord Protector, he issued a proclamation saying that, since he had deposed the former king, all royal lands and possessions were his to distribute as he saw fit. He essentially behaved like a conqueror and treated England like a conquered territory. Maybe he was preparing to declare himself king, but he knew that he needed more time. After all, Charles I was still out there raising armies and trying to reclaim the throne. But Bacon didn't have that much time. His enemies in Parliament were already looking for a way to get rid of him. In August, they introduced a vote of no confidence in his leadership, which passed with 129 votes to 5. 5 members voted for Bacon. Not coincidentally, they were the same 5 who had backed his coup against Charles. Everyone else either didn't show up to vote or voted against him. At this point, it might have been wise for Bacon to flee the country, or at least go abroad for a while and bide his time. But as primerasa, he had no interest in the common people. He didn't care about winning them over, and without their support, he was nothing. And so when the vote of no confidence came through, he did the only thing he could think to do. He fled to Normandy. Now, obviously, this was a mistake. There was no way he was going to succeed in France. And once he realized this, he returned to England and spent his remaining days plotting revenge. He tried to raise an army in Kent, but the locals refused to support him, and so he gathered a small group of friends and lived off the land, essentially becoming a member of the nobility. He hunted down the local justices of the peace and arrested them, seizing their estates and selling their goods to pay for his soldiers. It was during this time period that he contracted dysentery. It's unclear exactly when he came down with it, but it seems likely that it happened shortly after he arrived in London. Dysentery is extremely rare in England, but it was common in Mesopotamia and other parts of the Middle East. Most historians believe Bacon contracted it while fighting in the region. As he lay dying, he understood what had happened. He gambled everything on his coup and lost. Now he was a wanted man with a deadly disease and no friends left. As he wrote to Parliament, pleading for mercy, he said, "I find myself in a condition most grievous. My body is a kind of dead, my mind greatly afflicted, my estate ruined, my friends and servants gone from me, my purse empty. Only my guilt remains, which I desire to take off by some act of public utility before I die. But Parliament rejected his pleas for mercy and continued to hunt him down. He died believing that he had been betrayed by everyone, including his friends, family, and God. In his final moments, he spoke of his loneliness and asked for forgiveness. But as he lay in his grave, he was still alone. His dream of being king had ended in tragedy, and as his friends and enemies prepared to fight another battle, the only sound that broke the silence was the wind whispering through the trees. If you enjoy this series, check out the series on the Wars of the Roses. And thank you all so much for watching. The men who fell to their deaths were once the most feared warriors in all of England. Now they hung limp and lifeless from the portcullis of Berkeley Castle, dangling like overripe fruit before finally being chopped down by William the Conqueror's executioner. For these rebels had been captured with arms in their hands after they'd pillaged the town, massacring its people and burning its homes. Their ringleaders were taken to the top of the castle and paraded before King William, who sat upon a throne constructed for the occasion. The king listened impassively as each man was sentenced to death, his face betraying nothing of what he might be thinking. When it was done, the nobles watched as the condemned were led away to their doom. Then he turned and walked back into the castle, leaving the crowd to their morbid fascination. This is a history hot tip, and today we look at Chapter 10 of the Anarchy, where without Bacon's leadership, the movement unravels. But for more information, check out my series in the pinned comment below. When Robert, Earl of Gloucester, heard that Bristol had fallen to King Henry's forces, he knew that he had to move fast. Henry's army was now dangerously close to his brother's base of operations in Exeter, and he had to do something before the two armies met. So he set off with all possible haste, arriving just as the citizens of Bristol prepared to defend themselves against the approaching royal army, and Robert joined the townspeople on the walls, readying himself to fight to the death if necessary. But then something unexpected happened. Royal troops arrived to relieve him, and soon the town was theirs. But while this victory was important, it wasn't decisive enough. So Robert hurried on to Bath, where Henry had gone to regroup. He intended to surprise the king's forces as they made camp, but he was too late, and instead he found himself forced to attack an entrenched army. And though his cavalry broke through the royal lines, he couldn't press his advantage. Not only was the English terrain too hilly for his heavy cavalry to maneuver, but his infantry was lacking, and so he was forced to retreat with the army he commanded, leaving Henry in possession of the field. Undeterred, Robert made one final stand at the siege of Bridgewater. Here he hoped to keep the English army at bay until reinforcements could arrive from Normandy, where the young King Stephen was recovering from a fall. But unfortunately for Robert, the citizens of Bridgewater refused to fight alongside him. They'd suffered greatly during the Civil War, and they wanted peace. And when the royal army arrived, the townspeople opened the gates to them. Again, Robert had to flee, this time with his tail between his legs. He'd failed in his mission to protect his half-brother's interests, and he could only watch as King Henry advanced on Exeter. His last remaining base, Exeter, fell quickly, and King Stephen was forced to flee to Normandy, where he died shortly afterwards, having lost both his kingdom and his crown jewels in the struggle. With Stephen's demise, any hope for a restoration of the House of Blois died, and even worse, King Henry was now free to deal with the threat posed by Empress Matilda. And speaking of the Empress, she was sailing to England with her son, the future King Henry II, hoping to finally take the English throne. But when her fleet arrived at the coast of Devon, she found herself under attack by English naval forces. Her ships were driven back into the sea, and she had to flee to Normandy, where she would spend the remainder of her life. The Civil War was over. King Henry II had won, but not everyone was happy with the outcome. Rumors had been circulating for years about the illegitimacy of the royal line, and many Englishmen felt that a new dynasty was needed. And so as the country began to heal itself from the wounds of civil war, disaffected nobles began planning their revenge. The ringleader was Thomas, Count of Norfolk, a man who had served King Stephen faithfully, and he soon attracted followers to his cause, men who had suffered during the Civil War and who felt that the crown had been unjustly seized. At first, the rebellion remained hidden, a series of anonymous attacks on the royal family and their supporters. But as time passed, the rebels grew bolder. In 1155, the conspirators attacked and killed William de Tracy, a favorite of King Henry and one of the chief architects of the Angevin state. And soon they were ready for more, and so they reached out to foreign princes, hoping to find a new champion, a warrior willing to lead them to victory. And they found that man in the person of Hugh, Count of Brittany. Hugh was ambitious, and he saw an opportunity to expand his power by seizing the English throne for himself. And so he assembled an army and sailed for England. There he met with the rebels, and together they marched on London. But they weren't ready for what happened next. London had suffered greatly during the Civil War. Entire sections of the city had been burned, and thousands of its citizens had died. And so when Hugh and his men approached, the city gates were opened to them without a fight. And with the capital secured, the rebels were ready to declare Hugh the new King of England. But before they could do so, he was captured by royal troops and thrown into the Tower of London, where he awaited execution. One by one, the conspirators were rounded up and brought to the king, and as they stood before him, they confessed their deeds and begged for mercy. But Henry wasn't in a forgiving mood, and so he ordered them all to be hanged, drawn and quartered, the worst punishment the English could conceive. And as they died, he left no doubt as to the reason why. He accused them of nothing less than high treason. With the threat of invasion removed, Henry was able to turn his attention to other matters, secure in the knowledge that he would reign as King of England, unchallenged for the rest of his days. And as the decades passed, his son took the English crown and then the French one, creating the Angevin Empire, which stretched from the Scottish border to the Mediterranean Sea. And so our tale comes to an end. If you enjoyed this episode, please remember to leave a thumbs up on this video and subscribe to my channel so you never miss an episode of Hurry and the Heston. And don't forget to check out the series in the description if you want to learn more. Thanks for watching. As we learned in Chapter 10, when the colonists went to war against the French in 1689, they got more than they bargained for. Berkeley had ordered them not to attack the French in the interior of the colonies unless attacked first, and he also promised that he would have no part in any attacks that threatened the safety of New France. So while the colonists did fight the French along the Ohio River and even captured Fort Necessity, they didn't make any major incursions into French-held territory. However, once they were defeated by the Marquis de Denonville at the Battle of Caransabies, all bets were off. Berkeley was furious with the colonists. He felt they'd thrown away an opportunity to destroy New France and now threatened reprisals. The colonists had no idea just how severe those reprisals would be. Berkeley began confiscating livestock from the frontiersmen, taking 400 head of cattle and 200 hogs from them. He then forced them to turn over their weapons and ammunition, and finally banned them from trading with the Indians. In addition, he sent 2 of his officers to the Ohio Valley to arrest anyone who participated in the war effort. When the news of these reprisals reached the Virginia capital of Williamsburg, the House of Burgesses met in protest. They sent delegates to talk to Berkeley, but he refused to listen to them. The next day issued a proclamation stating that martial law would continue until order was restored. The colonists realized that their only recourse was to appeal to the king. They wrote a letter to King Charles II pleading their case and asking him to replace Berkeley with a more moderate governor. But the king was already planning to replace Berkeley, and he was unreplacing him with a new royal governor either. The severity of Berkeley's punishments shocked many people in England, including the king. The English public was very much anti-French, so to punish the colonists for fighting the French seemed like a strange decision. Also, there was no way to get supplies to the colony because of the war. This meant that the confiscated livestock and other goods couldn't be sold in England, nor could the goods the colonists produce be imported into England. On top of these, the colonies were suffering from a smallpox epidemic. All of this led to unrest among the colonists and even threats of rebellion. When word of this reached England, the king had no choice but to recall Berkeley and restore order in the colony. In 1697, following the end of the war, Berkeley left Virginia for England. He was a very wealthy man. In addition to what he confiscated from the colonists, he also received a grant of 30,000 acres of land for his services in the colony. Once in England, he was given a noble title, and he spent his remaining days running a casino and gambling hall. When things settled down in Virginia, the colonists elected a new governor. It was Thomas Culpeper, one of the delegates who had gone to England to complain about Berkeley. As a result of the war, however, it was decided that royal governors would be appointed to the colony from now on. And so the colonial era of easy rule by an elected governor came to an end. The representative government of Virginia remained, but its power was severely curtailed. One thing that the colonists learned from this experience is that they needed to improve their fortifications. Since the threat of French attack was still very real, the Virginia General Assembly funded the construction of several forts along the frontier. Fort C, which had been destroyed by the Senecas, was rebuilt and named Fort Cumberland in honor of the English king. Forts were also built at the mouth of the Kanawha River and near the headwaters of the Shenandoah Valley. These forts would help to protect the colonists from Indian attacks, but they also made it clear that the threat of the French was still very real. The Virginia colonists weren't the only ones dealing with Indian problems. The English colonies of Massachusetts Bay, Connecticut, and Rhode Island were also suffering from raids by the Wampanoag, Nipmuc, and Mohawk nations. To deal with this, the colonies formed the League of the Union in 1697. The League was an alliance between the colonies and the Iroquois Confederacy, who were mortal enemies of the Wampanoag. The Iroquois had been allies of the English since 1623, and the agreement was renewed in 1684. The agreement stipulated that the Iroquois would assist the English in their war against the Dutch in North America. But when the war ended, the English broke their promise and did not help the Iroquois as they had agreed. This led to tensions between the two sides, and the Iroquois eventually joined the French in the war, with the Iroquois now fighting against them. The New England colonies knew that they had to take action. In 1697, they sent out a force of 600 men to punish the Iroquois. The force was led by Major Rogers, who was known for his skill in Indian warfare. The campaign was a success, and the Iroquois were forced to sue for peace. The terms of the treaty were very favorable to the English. The Iroquois were forced to give up most of their land in exchange for a small annuity. In addition to dealing with the Indians, the English colonies also had to deal with the aftermath of the war. The war had devastated the colonies, and the economy was in sharp decline. The trade with England had been cut off, and the colonies had been unable to raise enough food to feed their populations. Many colonists had been killed or wounded in the war, and the economy was in sharp decline. The colonies were also facing a shortage of labor. Many of the colonists who had fought in the war had been killed or injured and were unable to work. The colonies also lost a significant number of slaves during the war, and this led to a shortage of labor. To deal with these problems, the colonies implemented a number of policies. The colonies began to rely more on their own resources for food and other supplies. They also began to develop new industries to replace the ones that had been lost during the war. In addition, the colonies began to attract new settlers through a number of incentives. These measures were successful, and the colonies were able to recover from the devastation of the war. In the years following the war, the colonies continued to grow and prosper. The population of the colonies grew rapidly, and the economy began to recover. The colonies also began to play an increasingly important role in the affairs of the empire. The colonies sent representatives to the British Parliament, and they began to have a say in the laws that governed them. The colonies also began to form their own distinct identity. The colonies were no longer just a part of Britain, they were becoming their own thing. In conclusion, the war between the English colonies and New France had a profound impact on the history of North America. The war resulted in the defeat of the French and the conquest of Canada. The war also had a profound impact on the English colonies. The colonies were devastated by the war, but they were able to recover and go on to become the dominant power in North America. The war also led to the development of a distinct colonial identity. The colonies were no longer just a part of Britain, they were becoming their own thing. If you enjoyed this video, then please consider giving it a thumbs up and subscribing if you haven't done so already. You can watch the next episode right here or check out more episodes on my channel. Thanks for watching. Well, hey there. Welcome back to my channel. And Chapter 12 of your textbook is titled A Turning Point in Colonial Society. And I am gone, and I hope you get an A in your class and a 5 on your exam in May. So if you're ready to get them brain cows milked, then let's get to it. Okay, so what was this turning point? Well, the first section of the chapter is called Bacon's Rebellion and its Aftermath, and that is our turning point. So why was Bacon's rebellion such a big deal? Well, you can see right here in the subtitle, it led to a massive increase in African slavery in the Chesapeake colonies. So we're going to talk about how this rebellion kind of got the ball rolling on that. Now, before we go any further, let me remind you that if you want me to keep making these videos, then by all means, subscribe. It helps bring more people to this content and keeps me motivated to keep producing. And while you're at it, if you leave me a comment down below letting me know that you subscribed, I will love you forever. Okay, but now, let's get back to those brain cows. So, here's the thing. When the planters in the Chesapeake colonies like Virginia and Maryland started bringing in large numbers of people from Africa to serve as slaves, they did not do that because they wanted slaves. They did not even view Africans as inherently inferior. No, they wanted indentured servants. People who would come and work for a set number of years and then be free. That was what they wanted. But there was a problem. See, when England went to war with France, that meant that less European men were available to come to the colonies as indentured servants because, they were needed back in England to fight in the war. So because of this decreased supply of indentured servants, the price of indentured servants actually increased. And that was a problem for the planters, because they had grown accustomed to buying these workers for relatively cheap. Now, this is not to say that indentured servants were treated well, but they were treated better than slaves, obviously, and many of them, after their term of service was up, received land grants and became small farmers. Now, the solution to the planters' problem, of course, was to find some other, cheaper source of labor. And so, that is when they turned to Africa. Now, once they started doing that, of course, the Atlantic slave trade began, and eventually there were millions of Africans transported across the Atlantic to serve as slaves in the Americas. All right. Next, let us consider the aftermath of Bacon's rebellion and how it affected the political structure of colonial Virginia. So remember that Bacon's rebellion was a conflict between the wealthy planters of Virginia and the poor, mostly landless men who felt that the former were getting all the benefits of the colonial government. Well, following the rebellion, the wealthy planters realized that they had been outmaneuvered by Bacon. After all, he had gotten the royal governor to agree to most of his demands. So to prevent another uprising, the planters took steps to ensure that they would always have more power in the colony. First, they started passing laws that made it almost impossible for anyone without property to vote. This was a big one. Also, they passed laws that gave the wealthy planters control of the militia. And lastly, they required that all taxes be approved by a 2/3 vote in the assembly. In other words, since money was everything to them, they made sure that they would always have a big say in how much of it the colony would raise. So Day and Bacon's rebellion resulted in the wealthy planters having even more power than they had before. And finally, let's consider how Bacon's rebellion contributed to the beginnings of the desire for colonial representation in Parliament. So remember, one of Bacon's main beefs with the royal governor was that he didn't allow the burgesses, which was the name given to the elected representatives of the people in Virginia, to impose taxes. Remember, the governor was appointed by the king and he had a lot of power, and he argued that only he had the authority to impose taxes. Now, this was a big deal because the burgesses represented the people, and for the people to have no voice in Parliament was a huge problem. So following Bacon's rebellion, the burgesses began to argue for more power. And although this argument would not result in any real change until the American Revolution, Bacon's rebellion was the first step on that road. Alright, let's move on. The next section of the chapter is called The Rise of African Slavery. And as you can probably guess, we're going to talk about how Bacon's rebellion kind of sparked the growth of African slavery in the colonies. So we've already talked about this some, but let's just summarize it quickly. As we saw earlier in the chapter, indentured servitude was becoming too expensive for the planters, because the supply of Europeans willing to come to the colonies as indentured servants was decreasing, and that meant that the price of indentured servants was increasing. So to solve this problem, the planters looked to Africa as a source of cheap labor. Once they started doing this, of course, the Atlantic slave trade began, and Africans were brought to the Chesapeake colonies, where they would live in bondage and never receive payment for their labor. Their children would also be enslaved and so on. So that's how Bacon's rebellion sort of sparked this whole mess. Now, we should pause here and remember that the English did not invent slavery. They did not invent racial slavery either. Both of those things were already well established in places like Africa and the Americas before the English showed up. So, keep that in mind. However, What the English did do was establish a system of racial slavery in North America, and that is something new and different. Keep that in mind as you study for your exam in May. Alright, next, let's talk about the conditions under which slaves lived. And remember that there were many different kinds of slaves in the Chesapeake colonies. There were some who lived on large plantations, and others who lived on smaller farms. Some were owned by wealthy aristocrats, and others were owned by poor farmers. Some worked indoors, and others worked outdoors. However, none of that mattered. All of them were considered property. And if you were a slave in the Chesapeake colonies, your life was awful. You had no rights. If your owner chose to sell you, you could be ripped away from your family and sent to another plantation. If your owner decided to work you to death, that's what you would have to endure. And you would have no recourse. Your life literally depended on the whims of your owner. And as you will learn in future chapters, slaves in the Chesapeake colonies had very few opportunities to improve their situation. And when they did try to improve their situation, the punishments were severe. Alright, next, let's talk about how slavery affected the demographics of the Chesapeake colonies. So as you can see, right here on this map, there was a higher percentage of Africans in the southern colonies than in the middle colonies. And certainly more than in New England. Now, remember, this is not a map of the United States. The United States did not exist yet. These are the British colonies along the Atlantic coast of North America. So you have to remember that the South starts at the Mason-Dixon line, which is right here, okay? So if you think of the southern colonies as being below that line, and the middle colonies as being between that line and the New York-New England border, you'll be fine. Anyway, the reason there were more African slaves in the South than in the middle colonies, or New England, has to do with the type of economy each region had. You see, the southern colonies had large plantations that grew cash crops, like tobacco, and on these plantations, there were many more opportunities for slave labor. In fact, the entire economy of the southern colonies depended on slave labor. The middle colonies also had some plantations, but their economies were more diversified. They had lots of farms that grew a variety of crops, and they had cities and a lot of artisans and craftspeople. Finally, New England was mostly just small farms. There were a few plantations, but they were in the minority. And the majority of people in New England were either subsistence farmers or artisans and craftspeople. So needless to say, slavery was not a big part of life in New England. Alright, next, let's talk about the impact of slavery on colonial society. So first of all, slavery limited social mobility. Since slaves were considered property, they could not own property themselves, and they could not free themselves or their children. And that meant that their children would also be enslaved and so on. This created a rigid social hierarchy in which rich white men were at the top and black people were at the bottom. Secondly, slavery led to the growth of cities in the southern colonies. And that is because many of the goods that the southern colonies produced, like tobacco, had to be processed in cities. For example, tobacco had to be dried and sorted and packaged in order to be shipped to England. And that required lots of labor. And so cities grew up around the plantations where this work was done. Lastly, slavery led to the growth of a strong sense of community among black slaves. Now remember, slavery was awful. I mean, really, really bad. But despite the horrors of slavery, the fact that African slaves were able to maintain their cultural traditions and build strong communities is really remarkable. Alright, we've now completed our tour of Chapter 12. So if you want me to keep making these videos, then by all means, subscribe and leave me a comment down below, letting me know that you subscribed. And if you need help getting an A in your class and a 5 on your exam in May, then click right here in the review packet and all your dreams will come true. I've included a link to this video right here in the notes. So if you want to go back and review, just click right there. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll catch you on the flip-flop. Hamer, out. Alright, it's time to finish up our jaunt into Colonial America with a look at Chapter 13, which is all about the legacy of Bacon's rebellion. And this is fascinating stuff, because here's something that we've encountered before in this course. A historical event that happened in one time and place, the rebellion of 1676, but its meaning changes over time. How do later generations interpret the rebellion led by Nathaniel Bacon? For some, it's a sign of things to come, a precursor to the American Revolution. For others, it's a cautionary tale about the dangers of factionalism and mob rule. And for historians, well, they have many different interpretations. Some see it as a class struggle between the wealthy elite and the landless poor. Others see it as part of the racial dynamics of the colonial South, with the poorer, mostly black population joining Bacon out of fear of dispossession. And still others see Bacon as a proto-democrat who was trying to expand suffrage to all free men. In other words, a champion of one man, one vote. So what's a fellow student to do? Well, as always, let's begin with the big picture. What were the main ideas of Chapter 3? First off, the legacy of Bacon's rebellion. Second, the interpretations of the rebellion by later generations. And third, how historians have interpreted the rebellion. Okay, first, the legacy of Bacon's rebellion. Remember that after the rebellion was put down by royal forces, the burgesses passed a law granting limited voting rights to freemen, who owned at least 50 acres of land. Now, when you remember that most of Virginia's male population could not vote unless he owned property, this was not very inclusive. But still, this was a step forward, and it helped to set the stage for universal manhood suffrage in the American Revolution era. Why? Well, because the franchise had been expanded to include more people. But second, by the 18th century, Virginians had begun to mythologize Bacon as a folk hero. See, when William Byrd the Younger published his journal posthumously in 1743, he cast Bacon as an early champion of liberty, who fought against the tyranny of the elite. And this interpretation caught on, especially after the American Revolution. You know why? Because the Founding Fathers didn't want another revolution, so they wanted to make sure that the masses knew that they could be controlled, and so they emphasized the role of elites like themselves in steering the ship of state. But in that process, they pushed Bacon further and further to the margins as a symbol of chaos and disorder. And so by the 19th century, Bacon's rebellion had become a mere footnote in American history. Third, the interpretation of Bacon's rebellion by later generations. So remember that during the Civil War, each side used the other side's version of Bacon. So the Confederates said that Bacon's rebellion proved that the real threat to Southern society was not slavery, but rather the Northern industrial interests that wanted to destroy the Southern way of life. And the Union said that Bacon's rebellion proved that democracy could triumph over aristocratic rule. But both sides were wrong. I mean, remember, Bacon did not appeal to a broad-based coalition of poor people of different races, united by economic grievances. No, Bacon's army was made up of poor land-hungry settlers. Yes, but they were almost all white. And after the war, Los Cos mythology minimized the racial dimensions of Bacon's rebellion. Finally, how historians interpreted Bacon's rebellion. So once historians began to take seriously the study of ordinary people, their everyday lives and concerns, Bacon's rebellion came back into the spotlight. Remember that social elites had always interpreted Bacon as a threat to public order. But historians realized that Bacon actually appealed to some of the same fears and frustrations that the elites themselves had. For example, the historian Edmund S. Morgan argued that Bacon represented a more democratic vision of Virginia society. He saw Bacon's program as a way of opening up the political system to more white men. And historians, like Philip L. Bush, have suggested that Bacon sought to transform the Virginia militia into a more representative institution. Now, this interpretation makes sense if you consider that Bacon had been elected to the House of Burgesses on a platform of expanding franchise, and he wanted more representation from western counties. But that doesn't tell the whole story either. So historians have also explored the racial dimensions of Bacon's rebellion. The historian James Axtell, for example, argued that the rebellion was essentially a race war in which the poor, mostly black population joined Bacon out of fear of dispossession. And that makes sense too, given that Bacon courted black support by promising to abolish slavery if he became governor. But even that doesn't tell the whole story, because historians have also interpreted Bacon's rebellion as an agrarian revolt. The historian Edmund C. Plowden, for example, argued that the rebellion was really a conflict between two groups of farmers. On the one hand, you had the tidewater planters who were well off thanks to their fertile lands and large enslaved workforce. On the other, you had the poor western farmers who lacked both of these things and they were deeply in debt. And this interpretation makes sense because the rebellion was largely confined to the western counties, and because Bacon tried to relieve his followers economic distress by distributing land and abolishing taxes. But then again, most of Bacon's followers were not landless, and there is little evidence that they were in debt. But okay, you get the idea. Historians have offered many interpretations of Bacon's rebellion, and no one interpretation can fully explain the complex causes and consequences of this remarkable event. Alright, now let's do a few of those big picture questions. Ready? Here we go. Question uno. Why was Bacon's rebellion so significant in American memory? Well, first off, it demonstrated that the colonial population could rebel against the established order. And second, it demonstrated that such rebellions would probably fail. So leaders like George Washington feared Baconian rebellions because they threatened social stability. But others, like Thomas Jefferson, celebrated Bacon as a martyr to liberty. So depending on your perspective, Bacon's rebellion could be a call to action or a warning to stay in line. Question 2. How did later generations interpret Bacon's rebellion? Well, as I mentioned earlier, the lost cause interpretation minimized the role of race in the rebellion, while the democratic interpretation emphasized it. And finally, question 3. What does Bacon's rebellion reveal about the nature of historical interpretation? Well, first off, it shows that historical events have multiple interpretations. Remember, no one interpretation can fully explain the causes and consequences of Bacon's rebellion. And second, it shows that historians are influenced by the historical circumstances in which they are writing. Historians don't just write about the past, they are part of it too. All right. That is, what is, in chapter 13. Let us finish up with a quick review of the key terms, and then we do some of those document-based questions. Okay, first term you need to know is the Glorious Revolution. That is when the English people deposed King James II and replaced him with the Protestant King William of Orange. And this was significant for North America, because it resulted in the English Bill of Rights of 1689, which guaranteed certain rights to the English people and barred the king from imposing taxes without the consent of Parliament. And the significance of this for North America is that it set the stage for republicanism. Republicanism emphasizes civic duty, public service, and the common good. It rejects monarchy and hereditary titles and privileges, and it celebrates the commoner turned citizen. And so, Republican writers like John Trenchard and Thomas Gordon celebrated the Glorious Revolution as an epic struggle between liberty and tyranny, and this work was hugely influential in shaping colonial political thought. And then you need to know about the English Bill of Rights of 1689. And I've already mentioned this. It is the product of the Glorious Revolution in which the English people deposed King James II and replaced him with the Protestant King William of Orange, and the Bill of Rights guaranteed certain liberties to the English people, most significantly the right to petition the monarch and the right to bear arms. And the significance of this for North America is that it inspired colonial resistance to royal interference in the affairs of the colonies. And then the last term you need to know is the Dominion of New England. So this was a royal colony that King Charles II created in 1664 by combining the colonies of Massachusetts Bay, Plymouth, Connecticut, and Rhode Island, and he did this in order to more tightly control colonial trade, and in preparation for the coming wars with France and the Dutch. And the significance of this for North America is that it foreshadowed greater things to come. For example, King James II attempted to impose the Dominion of New England on all of New England and New York, but the colonists resisted, and so the Dominion collapsed after the Glorious Revolution. And second, the Dominion broke down along the lines of class and religion. You had the wealthy, mostly Anglican elite who supported the Dominion, and the Puritan ministers and their followers who opposed it. So this experience helped to forge a sense of unity among the colonists, in spite of their differences. And finally, the breakdown of the Dominion of New England encouraged the growth of republicanism. Remember that republicanism celebrates the commoner turned citizen, and the Dominion of New England threatened to turn New Englanders into subjects of the king. So the experience of resisting the Dominion helped to turn them into republicans instead. Okay, time for some document-based questions. Remember, you can find these documents in the textbook and online. Okay. Here's question 1. According to this engraving, how does Bacon's rebellion threaten the social order of colonial Virginia? Well, according to this engraving, Bacon's rebellion threatens the social order because it pits the lower classes, the rabble, against the elite classes. the gentleman. In the distance, you can see Bacon's followers burning the town of Jamestown to the ground. And in the foreground, you can see a group of gentlemen fleeing for their lives. And if you notice, the artist drew Bacon as a kind of demonic figure with horns and a pitchfork, so the message is clear. The artist believed that Bacon's rebellion threatened to bring ruin upon Colonial Virginia. Document those. How does the Glorious Revolution affect the political development of the colonies? Well, according to John Trenchard and Thomas Gordon, the Glorious Revolution was a struggle between liberty and tyranny. And so, in their view, the best form of government was one in which the people were represented in Parliament. Antis' work, Thoughts on the Causes of the Present Discontent, was hugely influential in the colonies, because it inspired later revolutionaries to fight for greater political representation. Documentaries read the following excerpt from Bacon's manifesto, and then answered the question, what was Bacon's attitude toward the Native Americans? Well, Bacon's attitude toward the Native Americans is pretty clear. He wants to wage war against them. Says, the only way to prevent the increase of the savages is to attack them in their own country. And he says that his administration will raise a force of foot and horse soldiers to do just that. Document Cuatro read the following excerpt from the Virginia House of Burgesses, and then answered the question. Why were the Burgesses nervous about granting more men the right to vote? Well, think about the consequences. If the franchise were extended to all free men, you would open up the possibility for more people to participate in politics. And that might sound like a good thing, but remember that the Burgesses were a part of the elite class, and that class had always benefited from keeping the masses in their place. And so, extending the franchise to all free men would threaten the social order. All right, that's Chapter 13. And that means that we have finished Unit 3. Time to take a deep breath and celebrate because you have successfully navigated colonial America. And then come back next time for Unit 4, where we're going to explore the American Revolution. In the name of God, Amen. It's me. You can call me John. And this is Chapter 14, or perhaps you might call it Chapter 13. Let me explain. See, when they found the body of George Washington in the chancel of the family church at Mount Vernon, they brought him back here to Jamestown, the first capital of the Virginia colony and of all America. They wanted to bury him in the place that had been the cradle of his country. But upon arrival, they discovered that the old church, the one where he had been baptized more than 100 years earlier, was gone. Time and wind had scattered its timbers so that not a trace remained above ground. So then they dug a great pit right there in the governor's palace yard, the very spot where he had first set foot when he arrived in these lands, and they laid him to rest beneath an oak tree with cannons firing from ships in the James River. So come, sit with me by this fire. The night is cool, but the day has been hot, and the mosquitoes are thick as the shadows. Georgie's gone, taken to his eternal reward. But before we turn in for the night, I want to talk with you about the day. We have walked through so much together. I know it has been hard, even for me, and yet I thank God that you were here to see it. For if you forget what happened today, then it never happened at all. Or perhaps worse, someone else will write of it and make it what they want it to be, rather than what it truly was. So let us speak now while the memories are still fresh. And do not think I am trying to boast, for I assure you, I feel as little like a hero now as you must surely feel. But I suppose that sometimes people need to hear that someone else felt the same way they did, that they are not alone in their thoughts. And so I offer myself up for your edification. First, let us look at the faces around us. Now, tell me, have you ever seen such happiness? Never fear. No man could be more joyful than I am this night. But truly, my friends, everyone was walking on air today. Can you recall? On the Common, when the militia presented their petition to the council, and the president read it aloud, and then looked down and saw the signatures of Captain Thomas Nelson, Jr., of Robert M. Carter, of Richard Bland, men who had served in the House of Burgesses alongside him, men whom he knew and respected, and so he was forced to acknowledge that this was no mere rabble of commoners. This was a cross-section of the best and most loyal subjects the king had in all of Virginia. These were men of property, of influence, and they had put their names to the act of defiance. And then there was the countryside, where men and women came from their farms to join us. Can you not hear still the fiddler playing as the young folks danced in the street? And did you mark the redcoats, how they, too, seemed almost to enjoy it all. Except, of course, for Lieutenant Governor Dunn. He was ashen-faced and would not set foot outside his palace. He has gone to England, I hear. Cower. But most important of all, there were the Indians. Do you remember them? How they came riding in from the far side of the river, all painted and feathered, and raised the war cry. And then when the president asked who was with him, who would stand against tyranny, when he cried out, "No taxation without representation," how the whole crowd roared their assent. Do you not feel still the earth rumble beneath the thunder of their voices? It was glorious to behold. They say that the king's speech moved some of the Virginia. He spoke of reconciliation, of a desire for peace between the colonies and the mother country. But did you not notice that every word he said was hedged about with buts? If the colonists would only submit and send representatives to Parliament, if they would only agree to certain taxes, if they would just leave the king out of this affair, then there would be peace. But no, the colonists want to be free. They want autonomy. They want to chart their own future, and so the king grows angry and threatens war. But the colonists ask only for the right to govern themselves. Is this such a terrible thing? Can the king really claim that he has the right to send men 3,000 miles to legislate for people who have no voice in the making of laws which directly affect them? I say, no, it is not right. No voice, no representation. And do you not remember what the crowd cried in answer to the king? No taxation without representation. Let me tell you something, my friend. At times like this, a man needs to remind himself of the dreams of old. Men who sailed across a great sea to escape religious persecution, to find a new life here in the wilderness of the New World. Men who built the first crude fort here in the heart of a hostile land, and named it Jamestown after the king. Men who fought alongside men of color, and called themselves the United Colonies of Virginia, resisted the king's arbitrary rule, and won representative government who sent the first representatives to the House of Burgesses, the first legislative body in America. And you, yes, you who listen to me now, you are part of this stream, part of this chain of events that reaches back to the beginning and forward to who knows where. You and I are linked together through time and circumstance, bound by invisible bonds to those who have gone before us and those who will come after. Let us not forget what has happened today. Let us not forget what we have become. As the night grows late and the shadows stretch long, let us remember that we are here because we have a dream of freedom, a dream of a better world. And that dream is worth fighting for. Remember the words of Edmund Custis, the great orator who swayed the Virginia Convention to declare independence from the crown. Mr. President, it is natural that we should wish to know the extent of our future connection with England. No American, I presume, would willingly be a subject of a despot, but whilst we are thus circumspectly kept in the dark, no man can tell what shackles await our children or what connection our posterity may be destined to. Think you that the king would not wish to shackle you and your children if he could? Think you that the taxes would stop? I say that they would. And as sure as I stand here speaking to you now, the fight will go on until we know whether we will be free or not, until we know whether we will be a nation of slaves or a nation of free men. You have heard me speak of unity before, and it bears repeating. We are a colony of all different sorts. Rich and poor, black and white, native and immigrant. But today, we showed the world what we are capable of when we put aside our differences and stand together. We showed the world that when push comes to shove, we are Americans, first and foremost. And today, I believe, the spirit of America was reborn. Some of us have been born here in Virginia. Others have come from other parts of the colonies, or even from England. Some of us were born into slavery. Others, including me, were born free. Some of us have little. Others have great wealth, and yet we are united in our opposition to tyranny, and in our desire for a better future for ourselves and our children. This is a fireside chat. Come closer, my friends. Let the flames reflect in your eyes. I want you to remember this moment forever. Think of it whenever you face hardship or despair. Remember the joy, the unity, and the hope that burned bright within us all today. When the sun sets and the shadows grow long, we gather around the fire. And when the chill of evening creeps upon us, we huddle close together for warmth. And as the darkness deepens, we tell stories of our hopes and dreams for the future. Stories of a land where all men are created equal, where all people are endowed with certain unalienable rights, among them life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. A land where no king can tax us without our consent, where no tyrant can lord over us, where we are free to worship God according to our conscience, free to speak our minds, free to pursue our own destinies. And so we sit around the fire and dream of the day when our children will inherit this land of promise. And we hold on to that dream with all our might, for it is the only thing that gives us hope for the future. We are all brothers tonight, bound together by the ties of love and affection, by the bonds of community and the chains of slavery. And I say that being a slave is no less a condition than being a master. We are all brothers tonight, and I mean all of us, black and white, bond and free. We are all brothers under the skin. We are all brothers in arms. We are all brothers in the cause of freedom. And I say unto you tonight, let not the sun set upon your wrath, let not the night pass without your protest. For the time has come for us to be men, for the hour is struck when we must stand up and be counted. The die is cast. The decision has been made. The course of history has been set in motion, and there is no turning back. The only thing that now separates us from being a free and independent nation is the raising of a hand to take the oath of the United States of America. Are you with me? Are you ready to take that oath? Are you ready to be a member of this new nation? Then raise your hand, my brothers, and swear to me that you will stand with me in defense of liberty and justice for all. And if anyone here is not ready to take that oath, then I say to them also, let not the sun set upon your objections. Let not the night pass without your protest. For the time has come for us to lay our grievances bare and our disagreements known. Let us debate our differences with the fervor of men possessed of a common purpose and the determination of those who will not rest until justice is done. In the spring of 1676, Virginia's governor, Sir William Berkeley, put down a violent uprising of English settlers known as Bacon's Rebellion. The rebellion failed, but its causes and consequences would resonate across the centuries. Historian Alan Taylor calls it the first true American Revolution. What was Bacon's Rebellion, and why does it matter today? Let's get to it. All right, so let's begin with a little recap. As we talked about in the last episode, Bacon's Rebellion was led by a young man named Nathaniel Bacon. In 1675, Bacon rallied hundreds of men from the Virginia frontier who were angry about several things. They wanted more and cheaper land. They wanted better protection against Native Americans, and they wanted more representation in the colonial government. Now, to be clear, those aren't all the things that they wanted. These are just the things that the colonial government didn't give them. The real list of grievances is longer than that. But anyway, when Bacon and his followers marched on Jamestown, they actually succeeded in overthrowing Governor Berkeley's government and burning the town to the ground. And then they would have kept going after the indigenous people in Western Virginia had not the governor come back from exile with a royal navy and crushed the rebellion. Now, this is where things get kind of murky. On the one hand, Bacon's rebellion was defeated. Governor Berkeley reasserted his authority and things returned to normal in Virginia. On the other hand, though, Bacon's rebellion was a success in some ways. The colonial government did lower taxes, and it did address some of the other grievances of the frontiersmen. So was it a success or a failure? Well, it's complicated, and that's why historians like Alan Taylor call it the first true American Revolution, because it planted seeds that would grow into future revolutions. So what exactly does Taylor mean by that? What seeds? Why revolution? Well, the most obvious thing that Bacon's rebellion achieved was the destruction of the old order in Virginia. Old ways of doing things, old ways of thinking about things. All of it was swept away with the burning of Jamestown. This is pretty obvious if you look at Berkeley before and after. Before the rebellion, he was the embodiment of the old order. He was a member of Virginia's planter aristocracy. He was appointed by the king, and he held absolute power. After the rebellion, he was an old man without any power. He died 2 years later. So Bacon's rebellion was significant for ending the old order in Virginia. But that wasn't the only way that it changed things. It also helped pave the way for a new political culture. You see, as we discussed in the last episode, the issue of representation was a major cause of the rebellion. The Virginia House of Burgesses didn't represent the interests of the frontiersmen. It represented the interests of the planter aristocracy. So the frontiersmen started their own representative body, the Committee of Correspondence, which sent delegates to meet with Bacon in 1676. That committee survived the rebellion, and it continued to agitate for reforms in the Virginia legislature. And eventually, in 1680, the House of Burgesses was reformed. More people were allowed to vote for representatives, and the representatives themselves had to be elected by a majority vote instead of being appointed by the governor. Now, this doesn't mean that democracy is born in 1680, but it does show how Bacon's rebellion created conditions for democracy to grow. The idea that you should have a say in your government, that you should have representation in your government, that became part of the political culture in Virginia, and it never went away. And that's why Bacon's rebellion matters, okay? So let me pause here for a minute. We're obviously talking about a very dark moment in American history. A moment rooted in racism and violence and dispossession. And yet, we're calling it a pivotal moment for democracy. How can that be? Well, to answer that question, I want to introduce you to an incredible book called Freedom is a Constant Struggle. The book is a collection of essays that explores the relationship between freedom and oppression throughout American history, and it covers events like Bacon's Rebellion. Now, I read this book while I was writing the second episode of the series, and it really helped me think through the complexities of American history and how to talk about difficult subjects in a nuanced way. What I really love about this book is that it brings together such a wide range of voices. It has essays written by leading scholars like Eric Foner and Robin D.G. Kelley, as well as activists like Angela Y. Davis. It's incredibly comprehensive and deeply insightful. And now, let's get back to the lesson. Okay, so another way that Bacon's Rebellion matters is that it helps us understand the relationship between power and land, particularly on the colonial frontier. See, in order to attract settlers to the dangerous frontier, the English government offered them cheap land, specifically something called proprietary land. Proprietary land was land that was owned by the colony but granted to an individual for life. Now, this guy, Sir William Berkeley, held a ton of proprietary land in Virginia. He owned more than 300,000 acres, and he used his control over land distribution to maintain his power. The system worked like this. When someone came to Berkeley for land, he would say, "Okay, you can have this much, but no more than this." And he would make sure that their grant was as far away from his power base as possible. So if you were a wealthy planter like Berkeley, you got to keep your distance from those unruly frontiersmen. And for the most part, that system worked. The frontiersmen were happy with their land and they stayed out of politics. But it didn't work all the time. Sometimes people wanted more land. They felt like they were too close to other people. And when that happened, they would go to the House of Burgesses and ask for more land. And when the House of Burgesses said no, they got mad. And that's what happened with Nathaniel Bacon. So, to summarize, Bacon's Rebellion helps us understand the connection between power and land, between wealth and representation, and between disenfranchisement and revolution. In other words, it helps us understand the way that inequality works. And if we want to understand American history, we need to understand inequality. Just think about it. From the beginning, America has been defined by who doesn't have power. In 1676, it was the dispossessed indigenous peoples and the poor English settlers. In 1776, it was everyone except white male property owners. In 1865, it was everyone except white male citizens. And even today, it is everyone except those who face systemic discrimination based on race or gender or sexual orientation or religion or a number of other factors. The story of America is the story of who doesn't have power. And the story of who doesn't have power is also the story of how power changes hands. And that brings me to the final way that Bacon's Rebellion matters. It matters because it shows how even terrible moments can plant seeds of change. Look, I don't want to sugarcoat things. Bacon's Rebellion was terrible. It involved the killing of many innocent people and the burning of a colonial capital. But despite that, it also ended up planting seeds that would grow into future rebellions. It grew into the American Revolution. It grew into the fight for women's suffrage. It grew into the civil rights movement. This isn't to say that Bacon's Rebellion was a good thing. It wasn't. It It's to say that even bad things can have good consequences. Even terrible things can sometimes bring about positive change, and that gives me hope. Because look, if a rebellion rooted in racism and violence and dispossession could bring about positive change in the 17th century, maybe positive change is possible in the 21st century, too. Maybe that's the lesson of Bacon's rebellion. And on that hopeful note, we bring our series on colonial America to a close. I'm so proud of this series. I've loved making it, and I hope you've enjoyed watching it. If you want to watch more, please subscribe. And I want to take a moment to say a very special thank you to our supporters, whose names you can see on screen right now. And now, finally, a big thank you to my amazing team. To everyone who helped make this series possible, including my writer, Alex Key, my producer, Carla Siegel, my editor, Kyle Munger, my researcher, Danny Allen, my sound designer, Steve, and to all of our patrons. Thank you